This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I remember that December night because it felt different from all the others I had spent on the road. It was late, probably close to midnight. The air inside my truck was stale and dry from the heater running at full blast. My breath felt warm on my lips, but my fingers still ached from the cold. I wore thick gloves, but the steering wheel was freezing, and I could feel the chill through the leather. Outside, the landscape was white and empty. The road ahead was covered in snow, and the shoulders were piled high with dirty ice. The headlights of my truck showed only darkness and scattered flakes. I had been driving for several hours without seeing another vehicle. I just wanted to finish my route and find a place to rest. I was hauling a half-full trailer of packaged goods, mostly canned food and cleaning supplies. Nothing unusual. I had a schedule to keep, but I was not behind. I did not need to rush. I felt no pressure except the uneasy feeling that comes from being alone in a quiet place for too long. The radio barely picked up any stations. Sometimes I caught a bit of static, a muffled voice, or a few notes of Christmas music. It was December, close to Christmas. I cannot remember the exact day, but I knew the holiday was near because I had seen decorations at a truck stop earlier that evening. They had red bows and cheap plastic wreaths that looked dusty and faded. I tried to focus on the road. The lines were barely visible under the ice. I slowed down to avoid skidding. The tires crunched over frozen patches. The engine hummed at a steady pitch. The heater rattled sometimes, and I kept adjusting the vents to keep my windshield from fogging up. My eyes felt dry and tired, and the darkness outside seemed thicker than normal. After a while, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing behind me, just the pale outline of the trailer and the empty road fading into darkness. Then I noticed two small lights far in the distance. They looked like headlights. I squinted. They were faint, but I was sure they were there. Another vehicle was behind me, following the same route. I felt slightly better knowing someone else was out there, maybe a fellow trucker or a late-night traveler. I did not speed up or slow down. I kept the same pace and watched to see if those lights got closer. They did not. After several minutes, I checked again. The lights had not changed position. They were still the same tiny points in the distance. They were not gaining on me. They were not falling back. It was as if they matched my speed exactly. That felt odd. Usually, on a long, empty road, a trailing car either catches up or disappears. Keeping the exact distance for so long made me uneasy. I tried not to think about it. I turned up the radio. Static. I tried another frequency. I caught a faint voice reading the weather forecast. More snow coming, temperatures dropping. Then the station faded. I drummed my fingers on the wheel. I kept my eyes forward. Every 5 minutes or so, I looked back. Those lights were still there. Never closer, never farther. They just hovered at the edge of my vision. After an hour of this, I decided to pull over. I thought maybe I was tired, and it was making me paranoid. I saw a small rest area sign. It was nothing fancy. Just a patch of pavement with a trash can and a wooden bench. No lights, no buildings. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. I set the brake and looked behind me. If there was a car, I would see its headlights pass by soon. I waited. My engine rumbled softly. The night air seeped in through the vents. I saw no movement and no lights. I got out of the truck. My boots sank into the snow with a crunch. I walked around the trailer. The wind stung my face, and my breath formed small clouds. The area was silent except for the hum of my engine. I stood there for a minute, shifting my weight, trying to see down the road. Nothing. No headlights. I checked the tires. They were fine. I took a leak behind the truck. I felt the cold on my cheeks and neck. Then I climbed back into the cab and shut the door. I released the brake and pulled back onto the road. I drove slowly for a while. The road felt slippery. I focused on controlling the steering. Then I checked the mirror again. The headlights were back. They looked identical to before, at the exact same distance. I gripped the wheel harder. My heart beat faster. I wondered if I had imagined their absence. Maybe the angle of the rest area hid them. I told myself it was just another vehicle moving at the same speed. Maybe they were cautious on the ice. Maybe they did not want to pass. I turned the heater down because I was starting to sweat under my coat. Another 30 minutes passed. The lights never changed position. They stayed in my mirror, low and steady. It did not feel right. I decided to test something. I pressed the accelerator and sped up a bit. The engine growled and the truck shook slightly. The road was slick and I had to be careful. I watched the headlights. They also sped up. They stayed right where they were. I slowed down. They slowed down too. I cursed under my breath. My palms were clammy. My neck felt stiff. I tried not to panic. I thought maybe it was some kind of trick. Perhaps it was a reflection or a weird glare, but it looked too real, too solid. I could see two distinct lights, like a car or a pickup following me. I noticed a small town marked on my map. It was another 40 miles ahead. I decided to head there and stop at a gas station or a motel. I wanted to see if this vehicle would follow me into town. If it did, I would get out and ask what was going on. If it did not, at least I would not be alone in the dark. I drove carefully, keeping my eyes on the road and on the mirror. The lights never wavered. As I approached the outskirts of the town, I saw a few dim street lights and some houses with weak porch lights. There were no Christmas decorations here, or if there were, I could not see them. Maybe this place was too remote or too poor to bother with that. I slowed down to a near crawl. If that vehicle was behind me, I should see it more clearly now. There were no trees blocking the view, no curves. But in my mirror, the lights remained the same size, the same brightness. They never came closer. They never revealed a shape or a form. I took a turn onto a smaller street that led to a gas station. The station looked closed. It had a single pump and a tiny building with dark windows. I parked near the pump under a weak overhead light. I turned off my engine and waited. The night was silent. The wind blew a bit of snow into the lot. I could see my footprints forming in the slush as I climbed out of the truck. I stood there, looking at the road. No car came. No headlights moved past the intersection. I paced around the truck, checking the tires again, looking for any sign of someone playing a joke. I saw nothing. There were no people around, no footprints except mine. I felt alone and exposed. I opened the truck's side compartment and checked my tools. They were all in place. I closed it. The sound of the latch echoed. I decided to leave the town and keep going. Maybe the lights would not appear again. I got back in the truck, turned on the engine, and rolled out of the gas station. The tires slipped a bit on the icy pavement, but I managed to get back on the main road. I headed north again. The snow fell a bit harder now, and visibility was poor. I drove slowly. I strained my eyes to see if those lights would return. For several minutes I saw nothing, just darkness behind me. Then I caught a glimpse in the mirror. They were back, the same two faint lights, still at the same distance. I swore under my breath. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. I gripped the wheel tight. I tried not to imagine anything. I just focused on the fact that those lights were there. They matched my speed. They matched my stops, but they never showed themselves clearly. I decided to pull over again. I found a wide shoulder and stopped. I turned off the engine and the headlights. I opened my door and climbed down. The snow crunched under my boots. I walked about 20 feet behind the trailer and stood there. The road was dark and empty. If there was a vehicle, I would see its headlights. I saw nothing. I waited 5 minutes. My cheeks felt numb. My eyes watered from the wind. I could hear my own breathing. I heard a distant sound that might have been a loose sign creaking somewhere. I did not hear any engines. No other vehicles passed. I climbed back into the truck and drove again. Within a minute, the lights were in the mirror. I clenched my jaw. I stared straight ahead. I felt sweat under my coat. The heater was low, but I was sweating anyway. My stomach felt tight. My throat was dry. I took a sip from my water bottle, but the water tasted stale. I tried everything. I slowed down to a crawl. I sped up until I almost lost control on the ice. The lights always matched me. They never got closer. They never faded. I tapped on my horn. I flashed my brake lights. No reaction. Just those 2 points of light, steady and silent. At some point, I noticed footprints when I stopped. I had pulled over again, near a patch of snow on the shoulder. I got out and walked to the back of the trailer. I saw footprints in the snow leading up to where I stood. They were fresh and about the size of a person's boots. They led from nowhere and ended near the trailer's rear corner. I followed them for a few steps, but they stopped abruptly. I looked around, shining a small flashlight. The beam caught the falling snow and the empty road. No other tracks, no sign of a person. I felt my heart thudding in my chest. My breathing was shallow. I got back into the truck and locked the doors. I felt foolish, but I was scared. Something was not right. I drove on. The night dragged. The snow fell harder. The road seemed endless. The lights remained. I tried to ignore them. I looked straight ahead. I listened to my own heartbeat. I listened to the hum of the engine. I moved my shoulders and neck, trying to relax. I tapped the dashboard. I checked my watch. Time passed slowly. Eventually, I saw a sign for another town. I decided to stop there and find a motel. It was late, and I could not handle another hour of this. I needed rest. I followed the sign off the main road and onto a smaller route. The lights stayed behind me all the way. When I reached the town's single street light, I checked the mirror. Nothing. No headlights. I saw the empty road behind me and a few houses with weak lights in the windows. A dim Christmas decoration hung on a door, a string of red lights blinking slowly. I turned into a parking lot next to a diner. The diner was closed, but I parked under a street lamp. I turned off my engine and exhaled. My shoulders were tense. My mouth was dry. I felt weak in my knees. I got out and walked around my truck. I listened. I looked into the darkness. I heard only the wind and the distant hum of a power line. I saw no movement, no footprints besides my own. My eyes stung from lack of sleep. I climbed back into the cab and locked the door. I did not know what had followed me, or if anything had followed me at all. I just knew that for hours I had seen those lights, and when I tried to confront them, they vanished. I decided to stay there until morning. I would leave at first light and hope the daylight made everything normal again. I turned off the interior light and leaned back. I could not sleep well. I kept opening my eyes and checking the mirrors. I saw nothing. Eventually, I dozed off for a while. When I woke up, the sky was gray and the snow had stopped. The street lamp was still on, and the houses were silent. I wiped my face and checked outside again. No cars, no footprints, no sign of anything strange. I started the engine and slowly pulled back onto the road. I felt relieved. Maybe it was over. I never saw those lights again. I still remember that night, the empty road, the snow, the headlights that never came closer. I remember the tension in my body, the dryness in my mouth, the sting of the cold air. I remember the empty towns and the quiet darkness. I cannot explain it. I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. That is all there is. I remember setting out early that morning. It was late December, a few days before Christmas. I wanted to get away from the city for a while. I carried a small backpack, warm clothes, and some food. The trail was marked on a simple map I had picked up at a local store near the foot of the mountain. The clerk said few people took that path in winter. I did not care. I wanted silence. I wanted a place where I could breathe cold air and think of nothing. I started walking before sunrise. The snow was hard under my boots. My breath came out in short bursts. The trees on each side of the trail were dark and thin. I heard no birds. I heard only my own boots crushing the snow. My legs felt strong at first. I kept a steady pace. I wore thick gloves. I had a scarf wrapped around my neck and a wool cap under my hood. The cold pressed against my face, but I was warm inside my clothes. I did not see anyone else on the trail. After an hour, I saw some old footprints, but they were half covered by fresh snow. They did not look recent. I passed a wooden sign that was broken and unreadable. I kept going. The sky was gray. The sun stayed low. I felt my thighs burn as the trail began to slope upward. The silence was heavy. The trees grew thicker. I tried to stay focused on my steps. I did not want to slip or twist my ankle. Out here I had no signal on my phone. I turned it off to save battery. After several hours, I started to tire. I wanted to find a place to rest before nightfall. The map showed a small cabin somewhere ahead. It was not an official shelter, just an old cabin left by someone long ago. I hoped it was still there. I did not want to spend the night outside. The temperature would drop. I needed a roof. As I walked, the wind picked up. I felt it push against my hood. It made a low, whooshing sound. Snowflakes started to fall, light at first. They stuck to my jacket. I saw the outline of something in the distance. It looked like a small structure among the trees. I walked faster. My boots slipped a bit, but I kept my balance by leaning forward. When I got closer, I saw a cabin made of old wood. It had a simple door and no windows on the side I approached. There was a bit of a clearing around it. The snow was piled up against the walls. On the door, there was an old wreath. It looked worn and discolored. I touched it briefly. The needles felt brittle. I pushed the door. It was not locked. The hinges creaked. Inside, it was dim. The only light came from the open door and some cracks in the walls. I took off my gloves and rubbed my hands together. The inside smelled dusty and stale. There was a small wooden table and a single chair. On the floor, I saw an old mattress covered with a thin layer of grime. I kicked it lightly. Dust rose in the air. I coughed once. The cabin seemed empty. No one had been here for a while, I guessed. I dropped my backpack on the table and looked around. The ceiling was low with exposed beams. I could see no tools, no lanterns, nothing useful. I stepped outside again to gather some firewood. I found a few dry sticks under an overhang near the back of the cabin. I did not see any axe or saw. I would have to make do with what I found lying around. The temperature dropped further. My fingers started to ache from the cold. I carried the sticks inside and piled them in a corner. There was a small fireplace on one wall, just a hole with a metal grate. I cleared out some old ash and arranged the sticks. I lit them with my lighter and some paper I had in my bag. The flames were weak but warm enough for my hands. I closed the door and blocked the small gap at the bottom with my scarf to keep the draft out. I ate a protein bar and drank some water. My stomach growled, but I had to ration my supplies. I had enough for a day or two. I planned to leave in the morning and head back down the trail. I was only here to rest, not to camp for days. The light outside began to fade. The cabin grew darker. I turned on my flashlight and checked the corners. The walls had cracks. I saw spider webs in one corner. The floorboards creaked when I stepped on them. I saw no sign of animals or people. It was just an old, empty cabin. I rolled out my sleeping bag on top of the old mattress to have some cushioning. I kept my boots on. I did not want to expose my feet to the cold air. I sat there, listening to the weak crackle of the fire. I heard the wind outside. It pushed against the walls and made a soft moaning sound. I tried to relax. My back hurt a bit from the hike. I lay down and closed my eyes. At some point, I heard something, a faint whisper. I sat up and listened. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The cabin was mostly dark. I gripped my flashlight. I shone it around. I saw nothing unusual. I waited and listened. I heard a soft sound like someone breathing quietly. My heart beat faster. I got up slowly and checked the door. It was still shut. I checked the cracks in the walls. I saw no one. I pressed my ear against the wood. Outside, the wind still blew. Could it have been the wind? It sounded too human. I held my breath and listened again. I heard nothing now. I went back to my sleeping bag and sat there with the flashlight in my lap. My knees felt tense. I could feel my pulse in my temples. I tried to calm down. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was just some gust of wind through a crack that made a strange noise. I decided to keep my flashlight on for a while. Minutes passed. I started to feel sleepy again. The silence was deep. Then I heard a soft creak. It came from somewhere near the door. I turned my flashlight toward it. The door was still shut. I stood up and stepped closer. The floor creaked under my weight. I reached out and touched the door handle. It was cold. I slowly pulled the door open and looked outside. The snow was falling heavier now. My flashlight beam showed flakes dancing in the air. I saw no footprints except my own from earlier. No one was outside. I closed the door again and slid the simple latch that served as a lock. I heard my breathing, fast and shallow. I forced myself to take a deep breath. My chest felt tight. I sat back down and listened. The silence returned. I tried to sleep again, but I could not relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard a whisper or a shuffle. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination. There was no one here. I would have seen footprints in the snow. At some point, I drifted off. I do not know how long I slept. I woke up to a sound like a muffled voice. I bolted upright. My heart thumped hard. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around. I saw nothing. I stood up and moved the beam slowly across the walls, the ceiling, the door. Nothing. No movement. My mouth was dry. I swallowed hard. Then I saw something odd. The old wreath on the door had shifted slightly. It was turned at a different angle. I remembered touching it earlier, but I was sure it had hung straight. Now it looked crooked. I shined the light directly at it. I stepped closer. I did not see any reason why it would move. There was no breeze inside the cabin. I reached out and nudged it. It felt loose. Maybe it had slipped. Maybe my memory was playing tricks on me. I tried to brush off my fear. I told myself the wreath did not matter. I sat down again. The silence weighed on me. I heard my stomach growl. My head ached from lack of proper sleep. I closed my eyes and listened carefully. I wanted to understand the noises. They were faint, irregular. Sometimes they sounded like whispers. sometimes like gentle tapping. I felt my skin goosebump under my coat. My feet felt cold. I shifted position and pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. I decided to wait for daylight. I would leave at first light and head back to the main trail. I did not want to spend another night here. I watched the cracks of the walls, looking for any sign of movement. The air smelled of burnt wood and dust. I tried to guess the time, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, still too dark outside. I heard a light scrape along the floorboards. It came from near the corner by the table. I pointed my flashlight there. I saw the table and my backpack on it. Everything looked normal. I walked over and checked my backpack. The zippers were closed. Nothing was disturbed. I tapped the floor with my boot. The sound echoed. I did not see any holes or loose boards. I sighed and stepped back. Suddenly a soft thump came from the wall opposite the door. I spun around, shining the flashlight there. The wall was plain wood. I saw a few small cracks where light snowflakes drifted in. I walked over and pressed my ear against it. I heard a faint rustling sound outside, maybe a branch scraping in the wind. I looked back at the door and considered opening it again, but I decided against it. I did not want to face the cold and darkness outside. Inside, at least I had some shelter. I retreated to my sleeping bag and sat down again. I placed the flashlight next to me, pointing at the door. I wanted to see if it moved. The latch was in place. I touched it again to be sure. It was firm. I tried to ignore the noises. I tried to think about something else. My muscles felt tense. My hands were cold and slightly damp with sweat. I wiped them on my pants. Time passed slowly. Sometimes I heard a whisper, sometimes a creak. I never saw anything move. I never saw a person or an animal. Just sounds. My chest felt tight. I tried to breathe slowly. I told myself I was safe inside, but I could not shake the feeling that something watched me. I kept checking the cracks in the walls. They were too small for anyone to peek through. The door had no window. The wreath looked the same now, crooked and dull. Eventually, a dim light began to show through the cracks in the cabin walls. Morning had arrived. I stood up and stretched my legs. They felt stiff. I opened the door. The sky was gray, but brighter than before. The snow had stopped. The ground outside was smooth and undisturbed. I saw only my old footprints from when I arrived. No new tracks, no sign of anyone approaching the cabin. I stepped outside and inhaled the cold air. I turned around and looked at the cabin. It looked the same, quiet, empty. I felt relieved to leave it. I packed my things and tightened my boots. My fingers fumbled with the straps, and I noticed they shook a little. I felt hungry, but I decided to eat once I was farther down the trail. As I walked away, I glanced back a few times. The cabin shrank in the distance. I saw no one exiting or entering it. I saw no movement. It was just a dark shape against the trees. I picked up my pace, eager to return to familiar ground. The snow crunched under my boots, and the silence of the woods pressed against my ears. My throat felt dry. My mind raced with thoughts of the night before, but I said nothing aloud. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. I reached a lower section of the trail after a few hours. The footing was easier there. I found a small clearing and stopped to eat. I took a bite of a protein bar and drank some water. I looked around, seeing only quiet trees and snow. Nothing unusual. I wanted to be back at my car before dusk. As I continued walking, I noticed how tired I was. My shoulders ached from the backpack. My legs felt heavy, but at least I was moving, away from that cabin and its strange sounds. I never figured out what I heard. I do not know if someone was out there whispering in the dark. I do not know if it was just the wind. All I know is that I never saw anyone, and the next morning there were no footprints but mine. That was enough to keep me unsettled. I did not look back again. I just kept walking, focusing on the crunch of my boots and the cold air in my lungs. I wanted to reach my car, turn on the heat, and drive away. I wanted to leave that place behind. I still remember that night clearly. The cabin, the whispers, the strange feeling of not being alone, even though I saw no one. I will not forget it. I remember that night clearly. I had stayed late at the mall, even though most stores had closed. I had lost track of time. I stepped out into the parking area around midnight. The mall's overhead lights were still on, but dimmer than usual. The large concrete pillars and the rows of parked cars looked strange under the weak lighting. There were hardly any vehicles left. Mine was somewhere near the far end, where I had parked earlier to avoid the crowds. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as I left through the main entrance. The sliding doors were locked open. The mall security guard who usually stood at the door was nowhere in sight. I looked around. The air felt stale. I smelled something like old dust mixed with dampness. The space was huge, but it felt closed in. I heard a faint hum from the lights overhead and some distant mechanical noise. No voices, no music, just my breathing and my steps. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder. I tried to remember exactly where I had parked my car. I thought it was on the second level of the parking garage, near a painted pillar with a faded letter. I headed toward the ramp that led up. My shoes squeaked a bit on the smooth concrete. I passed a few abandoned shopping carts pushed against a wall. One had a broken wheel that rattled when I brushed past it. I tried to stay calm and focused. I just needed to find my car and leave. As I climbed the ramp to the second level, I saw a few cars scattered around. Most spots were empty. There was an old van near the corner, a sedan covered in dust, and my car somewhere ahead. The lighting was weaker here. A few fluorescent tubes flickered, making a soft buzzing sound. I saw my car parked near a pillar with peeling blue paint. It looked alone and small in the large empty space. I walked closer and reached into my pocket for my keys. As I approached my car, I noticed something on the windows. I shone my phone's flashlight. There were faint, dusty handprints on the passenger side window and the rear window. They looked like someone had pressed their palms there and dragged them slightly. I froze for a moment and looked around. I saw no one. The place was quiet except for the distant hum of the lights. My heart beat faster. I crouched beside the car and looked underneath. I saw nothing but dark concrete and some trash. I stood up and checked the doors. They were locked. I pressed the key fob and the car's lights blinked. The alarm chirped once. I sighed in relief. At least the car was still locked. Maybe some kids had messed around earlier in the day. Maybe dust from the ceiling had settled, and someone's prints showed up later. I tried not to think too hard about it. I just wanted to get in and leave. I unlocked the driver's door and opened it. The interior smelled normal. My seat and belongings were untouched. I tossed my bag onto the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. I felt the cool leather under my palms. I inserted the key in the ignition. Before starting the engine, I looked around one more time. I had a strange feeling at the back of my neck. I kept expecting to see someone appear, but there was no one. Just empty rows of parking spaces, concrete pillars, and flickering lights. I started the engine. The sound felt louder than usual in that silent space. I put the car in reverse and checked my rearview mirror. That's when I saw a shape move behind a pillar a few spots behind me. I only saw it for a second. A dark figure, maybe a person wearing something dark, slipping quickly behind the column as my headlights and brake lights lit the area. I caught a quick glimpse of an arm or a shoulder. Then it was gone. My stomach tightened. I pulled the lever and turned my head to see if I could catch another glimpse. Nothing. The space behind me was empty, except for the pillar and the dull concrete floor. I put the car in park and kept the engine running. My heart pounded. I wondered if I should get out and look. That seemed like a bad idea. I was alone here, late at night. I decided to just leave. Whoever that was, I did not want to talk to them. I eased the car into reverse again and backed out of the spot. The tires made a soft crunching sound over some loose grit on the floor. I pointed the headlights toward the exit ramp. The path was clear. I noticed my hands were shaking a bit on the wheel. I tried to calm myself. I just needed to drive down and out onto the street. The main entrance to the parking lot was open 24 hours. I would be safe once I got outside. As I drove slowly through the level, I kept checking the mirrors. Every time I passed a pillar, I half expected to see someone darting behind it. The lights overhead hummed and flickered. My engine sound was low and steady. I turned a corner toward the ramp that led down. I saw no one. Halfway to the exit, I smelled something odd. It was a damp, moldy smell that seemed stronger now. Maybe it came from the drains or some old water leakage. It made me slightly nauseous. I rolled down my window a bit to get fresher air, but the air outside felt just as stale. I reached the ground level and followed the arrows painted on the floor toward the exit. I saw a few empty guard booths near the gates. The barrier arm was up, probably left open after hours. Usually there was a security guard there, but not tonight. Maybe he was making rounds, or maybe he had gone home. I was not sure. I slowed down near the gate. I checked my phone to see if I had any messages. No signal in here. The overhead lights at the exit were dim. I looked in the rearview mirror again. I saw something move at the far end of the parking area. It was just a shadow near a car. I could not make out a shape. It could have been my imagination. Or maybe someone really was in here, hiding. My jaw clenched. I did not want to stick around. I pressed the accelerator and guided my car out of the garage and into the empty street behind the mall. Outside there were a few streetlights and some closed shops. I turned right and drove slowly until I felt safe enough to breathe normally. I pulled over a few blocks away in a better lit area. There was a gas station open late. I parked near the pump and stepped out. The cool night air hit my face. The smell of gasoline and distant traffic was oddly comforting. I looked at my car's windows. The dusty handprints were still visible. They looked like adult-sized hands, not too large, not too small. I tried to wipe them with my sleeve. The dust smeared. Now they looked like faint smudges. I went inside the gas station and bought a bottle of water. The clerk nodded at me. I looked around. 2 other customers browsed the candy aisle. Normal people, normal sounds. I drank some water and felt my heart slow down. I thought about calling someone, but who would I call? The police? I had no real crime to report. Just strange prints and a figure hiding behind a pillar. Maybe a homeless person was taking shelter inside the garage. Maybe a random prankster. I had no evidence of anything worse. I went back to my car. I sat behind the wheel and locked the doors. I checked the time. It was past midnight. I needed to get home. I lived about 20 minutes away. I pulled out of the gas station and drove through quiet streets. My mind replayed the scene in the parking lot. The dusty handprints, the quiet space, the fleeting figure. It all felt uneasy and wrong. But now that I was away, it also felt distant. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. When I reached my apartment building, I parked in my usual spot. The lot was small and well lit. I saw no suspicious figures. I grabbed my bag and got out. I looked over my shoulder a few times before walking inside. My building's entrance was locked, and I had my key. The hallway was quiet. I climbed the stairs to my floor, opened my apartment door, and stepped inside. The familiar smell of my place comforted me. I turned on the lights and checked the deadbolt behind me. I stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing slowly. My shoulders were tense. My legs felt stiff. I dropped my bag on a chair and went to the sink for a glass of water. As I drank, I noticed my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked tired and a bit pale. I tried to shrug it off. I had just had a weird experience. That was all. I decided to forget about it and go to bed. But sleep did not come easily. I lay awake, thinking about those handprints. They were so distinct, so deliberate. Someone had leaned on my windows, peering inside. For what reason? I had nothing valuable visible. Maybe they just tried the door and gave up. Or maybe they were looking for someone else's car and touched mine by mistake. And the figure behind the pillar, what about that? Could it have been a trick of the light or a shadow cast by my own car's headlights? I remembered seeing movement, but I could not be sure how much was real and how much was my nervous imagination. The parking lot was eerily quiet and empty. The mind can play tricks in such places. I got up and paced around the room. I checked my door lock again. I went to the window and looked down at the street. A few cars passed by. Everything looked normal. The city night was calm. Eventually, I lay down again and forced myself to close my eyes. The next morning, I felt better. In daylight, the memory of the empty parking lot seemed less frightening. I decided to clean my car windows. Down in my building's parking area, I took a cloth and wiped away the dusty marks. They came off easily. My car looked normal again. I went about my day, running errands and doing my usual routine. I tried not to think about the previous night, but I still felt a hint of unease when I remembered it. Something about the silence of that place, the stale smell, the flickering lights, and those handprints on my windows stayed with me. A few days later, I happened to pass by the mall during the day. Everything looked ordinary. People were coming and going, cars filled the parking lot, and there was no hint of anything strange. I glanced toward the spot where I had parked. It was occupied by a family van with kids climbing in. The scene looked cheerful and safe. I shook my head and walked on. I never found out who left those handprints or who hid behind that pillar. I never saw anything on the news about trouble in the mall parking lot. Life went on. Yet every time I think about it, I feel a tightening in my chest. I remember the dusty prints, the empty silence, and that split second where I saw someone slip out of sight. It made me careful. Now I avoid staying late at that mall. If I ever have to, I park closer to the entrance, near other cars and people. I learned that some places change after hours, and not always in ways you can understand. That's all I know. It was late, I was alone, and something felt off. I saw what I saw, and I moved on. But I will not forget how it felt when I realized those handprints were on my car, and that figure lurked behind the pillars, just out of reach. It taught me to keep my guard up when I am alone in empty places. It taught me that sometimes it's best to leave quickly and not ask questions. I remember that night because the road made no sense. I was driving alone. It was December, a few days before Christmas, and the air was cold. The snow covered everything on that rural route. I had taken a turn off the main highway to save time. It was supposed to be a shortcut through the countryside. A friend mentioned it once, saying it was a quiet back road that would lead me to my destination faster. But I had never driven it before. I wanted to avoid holiday traffic, so I took the chance. At first, the road seemed normal. 2 narrow lanes, old trees on each side, and small wooden signs now and then. The snow had turned the ground white, and my headlights created a tunnel of pale light. My wipers squeaked as they pushed aside light flakes. The engine hummed steadily. I tried to keep my speed low to avoid skidding on icy patches. I had my heater on, and the cabin felt warm. My breath did not fog the windshield. The radio was static, so I turned it off. I focused on the road ahead. I drove for about 30 minutes without seeing any houses or cars. Only trees and shrubs, all covered with snow. The silence outside was complete. Inside the car, I heard only the gentle whir of the fan and the crunch of snow under the tires. I was not worried at first. I figured this was a rural shortcut, and it might be a while before I saw signs of life. The map app on my phone showed no signal. I had expected that. I relied on the directions I memorized. Take the rural road, follow it straight, then it should lead me back to the main route in about an hour. But then I started seeing odd signs. At first it was a simple wooden arrow propped up against a tree. It looked homemade. It pointed left off the main road. That made no sense because there was no left turn there, only dense trees. I slowed down and peered through the windshield. Just trees, no path. I kept going straight. A few yards later, another sign, this time on the right side. It was a piece of wood nailed to a fence post, with a painted arrow pointing right. Again, no actual road to the right. I felt a small knot in my stomach. I tried to ignore it. I continued straight. The road began to curve gently. The snow fell a bit heavier now. The windshield wipers thumped rhythmically. I gripped the wheel firmly. After the curve, I saw another sign. This one was larger, about the size of a street sign, but crudely made. It had an arrow pointing straight ahead and another arrow pointing back the way I came. Both arrows were painted in faded red paint. The wood looked old and splintered. I passed it slowly. I checked my rearview mirror. The sign looked crooked, leaning against a small mound of snow. I said aloud, "What the hell?" to myself. There was no one to hear me. My voice sounded hollow inside the car. I pressed on. The road kept going, but I noticed my headlights reflecting on something metallic ahead. I approached carefully. It was another sign, this time a metal sheet hammered onto a wooden stake. It had no words, just an arrow pointing left, but on the left side there was only a small ditch and a row of thick bushes. No road, just deep snow. I shivered. I felt the hairs on my neck prick up. I did not like this. I decided to pick up speed, hoping to reach a known landmark soon. According to what I remembered, there should be a small bridge or a farmhouse somewhere along this route. I saw none of that. I saw only more trees, more snow, and these strange signs that pointed in random directions. Some looked newer than others. Some were made of old wood, others of plastic boards. They all had arrows, and the arrows always seemed to lead nowhere or contradict each other. I tried to calm myself. I told myself it might be some local prank, maybe kids playing a joke on drivers. But I saw no footprints in the snow, no tire tracks except my own. The snow was fresh and undisturbed. I began to worry about getting lost. Without a signal on my phone and no visible landmarks, how would I find the right way? I slowed down again as the road reached a fork. Finally, a real fork. Two branches split off, one to the left and one to the right. There was a large sign in the middle, made of a wooden board nailed to a stump. The left arrow was painted in red, the right arrow in blue. Both were large and sloppy. I stopped the car and lowered my window. Cold air rushed in. I listened. Nothing. No distant engines, no voices, no animals. Just the gentle hiss of snow falling. I turned off the engine for a moment. The silence was total. I started it again because I did not want to freeze. I chose the left fork because my memory told me I needed to keep generally northwest. The left fork angled that way as best as I could tell. I rolled forward, the tires crunching. After a few hundred yards, I saw another sign, this one painted with a green arrow pointing back. I looked behind me. Nothing, just my tire tracks in the snow and the dark shape of trees. My heart began to pound. I felt sweat on my palms. I wiped one hand on my pants. I forced myself to keep going. The path narrowed. It was still a paved road under the snow, but it looked older, less maintained. The trees were closer. The branches hung low, and some scraped the top of my car with a dry scratch. I flinched at the sound. I turned on my high beams to see better. The whiteness of the snow reflected back, almost blinding me. I had to switch back to normal headlights. The road felt wrong. It felt like I should have reached some farmhouse by now, or at least a driveway. Instead, I saw another sign. This one had no arrow, just a piece of wood dangling by a rope from a branch. It swayed gently in the wind. I could not make out any symbol on it. Maybe the paint had faded completely. My stomach churned. I considered turning around, but the road was narrow and my car was not small. If I tried to do a 3-point turn, I risked getting stuck in the snow on the shoulder. I kept going forward, hoping the road would widen or lead me somewhere open. I gritted my teeth. My chest felt tight. A bit farther, I saw a shape on the ground, half buried in snow. I slowed and rolled down my window again to shine my flashlight from my phone. It looked like another wooden sign, broken in half, lying face down. I did not get out. I just wanted to see if it said something useful. I leaned out a bit, my breath turning to steam. I could not read it. The letters were faded, and I did not want to spend time outside in the freezing air. I pulled my head back in, locked the door, and kept driving. I spoke to myself again. I said, "Don't panic, just keep going." My voice sounded shaky. I realized my shoulders were tense and my jaw was clenched. The heater blew warm air on my legs, but I felt a chill inside my chest. I was afraid. The signs made no sense. The road felt endless, and I had no idea where I was. The snow got heavier. The flakes swirled in my headlights, making it hard to see. The wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. I slowed down to a crawl. The car's engine hummed at a low pitch. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared ahead. It looked like a light, maybe a porch light or a lamp. My heart lifted. I pressed the accelerator gently. As I got closer, I saw a small clearing. At the edge of the clearing, there was a single pole, like a lamp post without a lamp. Attached to it was a box, maybe a fuse box or something. Next to it, there was a sign made of metal with letters I could not read from here. I stopped the car about 10 feet away and put it in park. I turned on my hazard lights and grabbed my flashlight. I decided to get out and check if this sign gave me any clue. I opened the door. Cold air hit my face. I stepped onto the snow, which crunched under my boots. I walked slowly to the sign, shining my flashlight on it. The metal surface was rusty, and the letters had peeled away. I saw only partial shapes. It could have been a marker for a power line or a property boundary. No arrows this time. just silence. I looked around the clearing. It was small, just a break in the trees. The snow was untouched, no footprints, no tire marks except mine. I aimed the flashlight into the woods. I saw trees, branches, and more snow, nothing else. Then I heard a sound, a soft crack, like a branch breaking under weight. I spun around, pointing my flashlight at the darkness. I saw no movement. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just the hush of falling snow. I realized I was wasting time. I hurried back to the car. As I reached the driver's door, I saw a fresh set of arrows drawn in the snow on my windshield. 2 arrows, made with a finger dragged across the thin layer of fresh snow on the glass. 1 arrow pointed left, 1 pointed right. They were not there before. I gasped and stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. I snatched it up, shining it around. There was no one. I ran to the back of the car, shining the light around the trunk, under the chassis. Nothing. My hands shook. Someone must be out here messing with me. I leapt into the driver's seat and slammed the door. I locked it. I wiped the windshield with the wipers. The arrows smeared into slush. I put the car in drive and pressed the accelerator hard. The tires slipped for a moment, then caught. I sped forward, away from that clearing. My headlights caught more signs along the roadside now. All of them had arrows or lines, none pointing in a consistent direction. Some were tilted at strange angles. I gripped the wheel and tried not to scream. I just wanted out. I pressed my phone's power button repeatedly, hoping for a signal. Nothing. I cursed under my breath. My mouth felt dry. My eyes burned. I forced myself to slow down to avoid skidding off the road. The snow kept falling. After a few more turns, I saw something familiar. The fork in the road from before, the one with the red and blue arrows. I had gone in a circle. I realized it as soon as I saw the same stump and the same sloppy paint. I pressed the brake and nearly slid into the stump. The car skidded a bit. I managed to stop. My chest tightened. They had led me in a circle. I put the car in reverse, backed up carefully, and chose the right fork this time. I had no idea if it would help. I just knew I could not go left again. I drove fast, ignoring the risk of ice. I had to find a way out. Branches scraped my roof. The car bounced on uneven pavement. I clenched the wheel until my knuckles hurt. Then, without warning, I saw headlights in the distance. I slowed. Another car was coming from the opposite direction. I blinked my headlights. The other car approached slowly. It stopped about 20 feet away. I rolled down my window a crack and waved. The other driver rolled down theirs. I heard a man's voice call out, "Are you lost?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "How do I get back to the main road?" He pointed behind him. "Straight that way, no turns." His voice was calm. I did not see his face clearly. He was just a silhouette behind his headlights. I nodded. "Thanks." I rolled up my window and drove forward. As I passed him, I looked at his car. It was an old pickup truck, covered in snow. He wore a dark jacket. I could not see details. He did not move. I followed the path he indicated. The signs were still there, but now I ignored them. I kept going straight, as he said. After about 20 minutes, I saw another clearing. This time it opened onto a paved road with a yellow line down the middle. I recognized it as a main route. I laughed, or maybe sobbed, out of relief. I turned onto the main road and picked up speed. Soon I saw a distant farmhouse light. Then I had a weak phone signal. I did not stop until I reached a gas station with bright lights and people inside. I never understood who placed those signs or why. I only know that I escaped. When I finally calmed down, I realized my hands ached from gripping the wheel. My throat was sore. I bought a coffee at the gas station and drank it in silence. I did not tell anyone what happened. I just wanted to forget the strange signs, the arrows leading nowhere, and the figure that touched my windshield. It still bothers me, but I made it out. That's all I know. I remember the night we arrived at that isolated inn. My wife and I had been driving for hours. It was December, close to Christmas, and the roads were covered in snow. The car's heater struggled to keep us warm. The windshield wipers pushed aside clumps of ice, making a scraping sound. We had hoped to make better time, but the weather was against us. We passed small villages with dim lights, then long stretches of empty road. No cars, no people, just a white landscape and darkness beyond the headlights. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when we saw a faint light in the distance. My wife spotted it first. "There's something up ahead," she said. I slowed down. My neck felt stiff from hours of driving. The headlights revealed an old wooden sign on the side of the road. It said something like pension and had an arrow pointing to a driveway leading off into the trees. The driveway was covered in packed snow, but it looked passable. We turned in. The car's tires crunched over the icy surface. After about 100 yards, we saw the building. A small two-story structure with old shutters, a dim porch light, and a sign that barely glowed, reading "Guest House" in faded paint. It looked old, but well kept. No other cars were visible. The place seemed lonely. I parked in front of the porch. The engine's hum died when I turned the key. The sudden silence felt heavy. I heard the wind rustling branches. Snowflakes drifted down, sparkling in the weak light. We got out, grabbing our bags from the trunk. The air was cold and bit at our faces. The front door had a wreath on it, brown and brittle. I knocked. After a moment, I heard footsteps inside. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, wearing a dark cardigan over a thick sweater. She had a tired face and dull eyes. She smiled, but it looked forced. "You need a room?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "Yes, please," I said. "We're traveling and got caught in the snow. We can pay for the night. Maybe 2 nights if the roads don't clear." She nodded and stepped aside. We entered a small hallway, lit by a single lamp. The smell of old wood and something stale lingered. My wife shivered and stood close to me. The woman led us down a short corridor to a room on the right. She opened the door. Inside was a clean bed with a heavy quilt, a small dresser, and a window with thick curtains. A dim lamp on the nightstand cast long shadows. "This is the only room I have," the woman said. "You can stay tonight. Breakfast in the morning. I lock the doors after midnight, so don't go out." "Thank you," I said. She nodded and left, closing the door behind her. We looked at each other. The room felt dated but clean. The silence was noticeable. No music, no TV, no voices from other guests. I listened for any sign of someone else. Nothing. My wife said, "She didn't say how much it costs." I shrugged. We would sort it out in the morning. We were both tired. The bed looked inviting. I double-checked the window. It faced a dark backyard with no lights. The snow piled up on the sill. I could see our footprints near the car from here. We washed up in a small bathroom across the hall, then returned to the room and got ready for bed. I turned off the lamp. The room went almost completely dark except for a faint glow from under the door. My wife lay down beside me, pulling the quilt up to her chin. I listened for any sound. The walls seemed thick. The inn felt empty. After a while I started to doze, but then I heard a noise in the hallway, a soft creak like a footstep on an old board. I held my breath. Another creak, then a whisper. I couldn't make out words, just a faint murmur. I reached out and touched my wife's arm. She was awake, staring at me with wide eyes. She had heard it too. I leaned close and whispered, "Probably the owner checking something." My voice sounded strange in the silence. She nodded but looked uneasy. I listened again. The whispers came and went, like someone talking very quietly, then stopping. Maybe it was just the wind, but it sounded too human, too close. We waited, barely breathing. The sounds continued for a few minutes, then stopped abruptly. I felt my heart beating hard. My wife's hand was cold in mine. We said nothing. Eventually we managed to sleep, but it was not restful. I woke several times, straining to hear any noise. The hallway remained silent. In the morning, pale light filtered through the curtains. I checked my phone. No signal. I got dressed and stepped into the hallway. It was quiet and empty. The house smelled like weak coffee. I followed the scent to a small dining room near the entrance. There was a table with mismatched chairs and a coffee pot steaming on a sideboard. The woman stood there, folding a cloth napkin. She nodded at me, then at my wife, who joined me a moment later. We sat at the table. She poured us coffee without a word. She placed a plate of bread and butter in front of us. The bread was slightly stale, but edible. The coffee was hot, but bland. I cleared my throat and asked, "Were there other guests last night? We thought we heard voices." She looked at me with a blank expression. "No, you were the only ones." I glanced at my wife. She lowered her eyes. I said, "Must have been the wind." The woman nodded but said nothing else. She watched us eat, standing a few steps away. It felt uncomfortable. I tried to start a conversation. "This area is pretty isolated, isn't it? Not many travelers this time of year." She shrugged. "Some come through, not many stay. The roads are bad." Her voice had that same quiet, distant tone. I noticed she asked no questions about where we were going or why we were traveling. Usually, innkeepers are curious. She showed no curiosity. She only watched. I drank my coffee quickly and stood up. My wife followed suit. We thanked her, took our coats, and went outside to check the road conditions. The woman said nothing as we left. Outside, the air was crisp and cold. The sky was overcast. The road looked covered in fresh snow, making travel risky. My wife suggested we stay another night. It was safer than risking a crash. I frowned, remembering the strange noises. But we had little choice. We had no signal. The map in the car showed few options. We were far from the nearest town. I agreed to stay one more night, hoping the weather would improve. We spent the day walking around the property. There was a small barn behind the house, locked tight. No footprints around it except ours. We circled the building, saw no other doors. The windows on the ground floor were all curtained. Upstairs, some shutters were closed. We saw no movement inside. It was eerily quiet. In the late afternoon, we returned inside. The owner was not in the dining room. We called out. No answer. We found a small sitting area with a worn sofa and a table of magazines. The magazines were old, yellowed, maybe decades old. My wife paged through one silently. I tried to read another. It felt strange, as if time had stopped in this place. As it grew darker, I decided to ask about dinner. I walked to the kitchen area, where a door stood slightly ajar. I knocked. No answer. I pushed it open and looked inside. The kitchen was neat but sparse. A small stove, a sink, a counter with a few utensils. A single plate rested in the sink, half-washed. A pot sat on the stove, empty. No sign of the woman. No food smells. I returned to the sitting area. My wife looked at me, worried. "Where is she?" I shrugged. We waited, whispering to each other. The silence pressed on us. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. The house was normal, just quiet and old. The owner was odd, but maybe shy or tired. Around nightfall, the woman appeared suddenly from the hallway. She didn't explain where she had been. She said we could have some soup and bread for dinner. We followed her to the dining room. She served a thin soup that tasted of weak broth and boiled vegetables. The bread was the same stale loaf as before. We ate quickly. She stood by the wall, watching us. Her eyes never lingered, but she didn't leave either. I asked if the roads might be better tomorrow. She said maybe. I asked if she had a radio or any way to check the weather. She shook her head. No radio, no phone. You can wait and see, she said. My chest tightened. No communication, no other guests, and a silent host. We finished eating. I thanked her and said we would go to bed early. She nodded. We went back to our room. I locked the door this time, sliding the small bolt. My wife whispered, "Do you trust her?" I shook my head. I don't know. She's strange, but maybe just private. We lay in bed, fully dressed except for our coats. I kept the lamp on. The silence in the hallway worried me. Hours passed. My wife dozed off. I stayed awake, listening. Finally, I turned off the lamp to rest my eyes. That's when I heard it again. The creaking floorboards, the whispers. This time, it sounded like more than one voice, or maybe one voice changing pitch. I could not tell. I sat up, holding my breath. My wife woke, startled. She grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my sleeve. I got up quietly and walked to the door. I pressed my ear against it. The whispers were just outside, soft and hushed. My heart pounded. I tried the door handle gently. It was locked as I left it, but I could feel a slight tension, as if someone on the other side touched the handle. I froze. My mouth went dry. I leaned back and put my finger to my lips, signaling to my wife to remain silent. The whispers continued, then stopped abruptly. I heard footsteps going away, very soft. I waited, counting seconds in my head. Then I turned on the lamp and looked around. Nothing in the room was disturbed. The window was locked. I looked outside, just darkness and snow. My wife looked pale. We barely slept that night. In the morning, we decided to leave no matter what. We packed our bags and went to the dining room. The woman was there, standing by the sideboard, a pot of coffee ready. She looked at us with a calm face. I said, "We're leaving today." She nodded as if she expected it. Over coffee, I asked, "Were you in the hallway last night?" I tried to keep my voice steady. She frowned slightly. "No," she said. "I sleep in my room. Maybe you heard the wind." I glanced at my wife. The tension in the air was thick. I said, "We heard footsteps and whispering." The woman's eyes narrowed. For a moment she said nothing. Then she shrugged. "You're the only guests." She walked toward the hallway, leaving us alone. We finished our coffee quickly. I went to pay her. She quoted a price that seemed high, but I didn't argue. I just wanted out. I handed over the cash. She counted it slowly, then looked up. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice flat. I hesitated. "Not really. It was noisy," I said. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. She said nothing else. We took our bags and stepped out into the cold morning air. The snow had stopped. The car started with a groan, and we reversed out of the driveway. I looked back at the house. The woman stood on the porch, watching. Her face revealed no emotion. The old shutters looked crooked in the daylight. The wreath on the door seemed even more brittle and lifeless. We followed the empty road back to the main route, driving slowly. The snow was still thick, but drivable. After about an hour, we reached a small town with a gas station and a store. We stopped. I asked a local man if he knew about the guest house down that old road. He shrugged and said there were a few places out there, but he hadn't heard of one open this time of year. Most closed for winter. My wife and I looked at each other. We didn't press the issue. We filled the tank and moved on, glad to be free of that place. We never found out who else might have been in that house or what caused the whispers at night. We never learned why the owner acted so strangely. We just know we stayed one night, heard things that made no sense, and left as soon as we could. The memory still makes me uneasy. The silence of that place, the odd behavior of the owner, the footsteps and whispers in the dark. These details remain clear in my mind. We have stayed in many inns and motels over the years, but that one stands out. I don't want to return. It felt like we were not alone, but we never saw anyone else. That's enough to keep me from ever going back. I moved into the new house on a Tuesday in late autumn. The air was cold, and the sky was dark by the time I finished bringing in the last boxes. The neighborhood was quiet. I did not see anyone outside. No children playing, no neighbors waving hello. Just silence and the sound of my car's engine cooling. I locked my front door and looked through the living room window. The streetlights were dim and spaced far apart. The houses looked similar. Small yards, modest fences, old paint. I remember thinking it seemed peaceful. The next evening, after unpacking most of my stuff, I decided to sit on my couch and rest. Through the window, I noticed the backyard of the house next door. I could see it clearly because my living room faced their side yard. There was a swing set with one seat. It looked old, with frayed ropes and chipped paint on the wooden seat. The strange thing was that it was moving. Not a gentle sway, but a steady back and forth motion, like someone had just jumped off it and left it swinging. But I saw no one there. I stood up and moved closer to my window. I pressed my face near the glass to see better. The neighbor's yard had no lights on. The windows of that house were closed and dark. I waited a few minutes, watching. The swing did not stop. There was no wind. The branches of the small tree nearby were still. Nothing else moved. I felt a slight tension in my shoulders, but I told myself it could be a breeze I could not feel. After a while, I got tired of watching and turned on the TV to distract myself. The next night, I remembered the swing and checked again. It was the same situation. No lights in the neighbor's windows, no sound, just that single swing moving back and forth in the darkness. I frowned. I could not see the ropes clearly in the dark, but the seat looked like it was going at a steady rhythm. I opened my window a crack to listen. No wind. I heard only distant traffic and maybe a dog barking somewhere far away. But the swing kept moving. I tried not to worry about it. I had other things to do. I still had boxes to unpack and work to catch up on. I closed the window and made a note to myself to check again tomorrow. On the third night, I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a creaking sound. At first, I thought it was something in my own house, maybe the old heating system or wood settling. But the sound came again, a gentle creak, like a rope twisting against metal. I realized it sounded like the swing. I got up, walked to the living room, and looked out. Sure enough, the swing was in motion again. I leaned closer to the window pane, pressing my fingertips against the cool glass. The seat kept moving, back and forth, no one visible. I watched for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. My eyes got tired. Then I heard something else, very soft. It sounded like a quiet giggle, or maybe a whisper. It was hard to be sure. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, a faint laughter, very distant, but I had no idea where it came from. The neighbors' windows were still dark. I felt a chill on my neck. I closed my curtains and tried to sleep. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some kids in another yard. The next morning I checked the neighbor's yard in daylight. The swing was still there, hanging quietly. It was not moving now. I saw no footprints in the grass, no worn patches where someone might stand and push it. The curtains in the neighbor's windows were drawn. I could not see inside. The rest of the yard looked neglected, with leaves piled up against the fence and the lawn untrimmed. Maybe no one lived there. Maybe the house was empty. The sign on the front had no realtor's number. It just looked abandoned. I went about my day, went to work, came back late. That night, I felt uneasy as I walked into the living room and glanced outside. The swing moved again, steady and slow like a pendulum. This time, I decided to step outside. I put on my coat, walked through my own yard, and approached the low fence that separated our properties. The air was cold. My breath formed small clouds. I heard nothing but the gentle squeak of the swing. I leaned over the fence. The swing was about 10 feet away. Its seat swung forward and back, forward and back. I could hear the rope rubbing against the frame. Still no wind, still no sign of anyone pushing it. I said quietly, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the dark. No answer. The swing slowed a bit but kept moving. I had a sudden urge to walk right up to it and grab it, just to stop it from moving, but I did not want to trespass. I returned to my house, locked the door, and turned on all the lights. That night, I slept poorly. I woke up several times listening for that giggle. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, very faint. I got up, crept to the living room window, and peeked out through a gap in the curtain. The swing was in motion. I saw a slight shape this time, maybe a shadow passing quickly behind it. I could not be sure. It could have been my reflection or a trick of the light from the street lamp. Still, I felt my heart pounding. I could not explain this. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I worked late, stayed in my bedroom at night, and avoided looking outside. But curiosity got the best of me. One evening, about a week after I moved in, I decided to watch the swing for a longer period. I turned off my TV, my lights, and stood quietly near the window. The swing started moving around midnight. It had become routine. I listened carefully. The squeaking sound, the faint rustling, and then that soft laughter. It was not full laughter, more like someone stifling a giggle. It lasted only a second or two each time, then silence. Then maybe another giggle a few minutes later. I tried knocking on the wall to see if anyone would react. No change. I tried turning on my porch light to shine into their yard. The moment I flicked it on, the swing slowed to a stop within a minute, as if it did not want to be seen under bright light. I turned off the porch light and waited. About 15 minutes later, it started again. This pattern disturbed me. I began feeling jumpy inside my own home. Every small noise made me tense. I checked the locks twice before bed. I closed all curtains so no one could see inside. The idea that someone was playing a prank crossed my mind. Maybe a neighbor's kid sneaking into that yard to scare me. But I never saw footprints or any sign of human activity. The yard looked untouched except for that moving swing. One night I decided to get a closer look. I waited until the swing was in motion and the laughter had started. Then I slipped out my back door, staying low, and crept along my fence line until I reached the corner where I could cross over. I climbed the fence carefully, trying not to make noise. My heart was beating fast, and my palms were sweaty despite the cold air. When I dropped into their yard, I landed softly on grass and damp leaves. I crouched behind a bush and listened. The swing kept moving, creaking softly. I peeked around the bush. The swing was only a few feet away now. It moved in a gentle arc. The ropes looked old and frayed. The seat was chipped and worn. No one sat on it. I saw no hands pushing it. My mouth felt dry. I took a slow step forward, keeping low. The swing continued. I reached out, holding my breath, and grabbed the rope as it swung toward me. The rope felt rough under my hand. The seat bumped into my shin. The swing stopped. I held it still. The night was silent except for my own breathing. I let go. The swing hung motionless. No laughter, no whisper, nothing. I stood there for a minute, waiting. Nothing happened. I sighed and let myself relax a bit. Maybe it was all in my head. I turned to go back to my yard, and that's when I heard a small click behind me, like a twig snapping. I spun around. The swing was moving again, but I had not heard the rope start. It was just suddenly in motion, as if I had never stopped it. I stepped back, startled. I looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide and no one visible. The windows of the house were still dark. I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice shook. No answer. The swing moved faster now, as if someone had given it a strong push. It soared forward and back, making the ropes strain. I backed away, nearly tripping over a stone. I caught my balance and ran for the fence. I scrambled over it and dropped into my own yard, breathing hard. I locked my back door behind me and stood in the kitchen, hands on my knees, trying to calm down. This was impossible. Objects do not move by themselves. Someone had to be doing it. But how? Why no footprints, no sound of running, no figure in the dark? I decided I had to call someone about this. Maybe ask a neighbor if they knew anything about that house. The next day, I walked over to the house across the street, an older man who seemed friendly enough. I asked him if he knew who lived next door. He shook his head. That place has been empty for a while. Last family moved out years ago. People say it's hard to sell. He did not elaborate. I asked if he ever saw the swing move. He gave me a curious look and said he never noticed. He seemed uncomfortable with the subject, so I let it drop. That night, I considered staying somewhere else. Maybe a hotel. But I was too embarrassed. I tried to ignore the swing. I closed my curtains and put on some music. I sat on the couch, reading a magazine, trying not to think about it. Around midnight, I heard the creaking again. Even with the curtains closed, I could imagine it swinging back and forth. I turned up the music. The laughter came anyway, a faint sound slipping under the door, or maybe just in my head. I decided to confront it once more. I grabbed a flashlight and opened my front door. I walked around to the street side and approached the neighbor's gate. The gate was locked. The yard looked empty. I could see the swing silhouetted by the faint moonlight. It moved, steady and slow. I shone the flashlight on it. The moment the light hit it, the swing slowed. I held the beam steady. Within a minute it had stopped completely. I pulled the flashlight away. I waited. After a few minutes in the dark, it started up again. I tried to catch it off guard by flicking the light on suddenly. It would slow and stop. This was consistent. It hated the light, or whoever was controlling it hated being seen. After this strange test, I went inside, locked my doors, and tried to sleep. Over the next few nights, nothing changed. The swing moved every night. The laughter came in soft bursts. I could not rest well. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A haunted swing next door in an empty house. They would laugh at me. I considered putting up a camera, but I had a feeling it would not show anything. After about 2 weeks, I reached a point of exhaustion. I decided to leave for a few days, stay with a friend in another town. I packed a small bag and left early in the morning. I spent 3 days away, not thinking about that swing. When I returned, I hoped it would be over. But on my first night back, as I sat in darkness, I heard the squeak again. I looked outside, and it was still there, swinging as always. Eventually, I learned to live with it. I stopped trying to catch it. I closed my curtains every night, played white noise to drown out the creaking and laughter. Over time, I told myself it did not matter. I tried to treat it like a strange, natural occurrence. But I never felt truly comfortable in that house. Sometimes I wonder if I should have moved. Sometimes I think about tearing down the fence and removing that swing altogether. But I never did. The house next door remained empty. The windows stayed closed. The swing kept moving at night, and I never saw who made it move or where that laughter came from. I just learned to coexist with it, feeling uneasy every evening, waiting for the first squeak of the rope and the faint giggle that always followed. I still remember the day I took that old back road. It was December, close to Christmas, and the main highway was blocked by an accident. I had no choice but to drive along a secondary route that my GPS did not recognize. The air was cold, and the sky was gray. The fields on each side were covered in a thin layer of snow. The asphalt was cracked, but still drivable. I did not see other cars. I only saw a line of old wooden telephone poles running alongside the road. I turned off my radio to focus on the drive. My headlights were on low beam. The heater in my car hummed quietly. The landscape looked empty. No houses, no barns, no signs of life. Just those poles stretching into the distance, their wires sagging slightly. I felt a bit uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. I was tired and wanted to reach the next town before dark. After a few miles, I noticed something odd. I heard a faint sound, like a distant ringing. It was hard to pinpoint the source. At first, I thought it might be something rattling in my car. I checked the glove compartment, the loose change in the cup holder, the phone in my pocket. Nothing. The ringing sounded metallic and distant, like an old-fashioned telephone bell. I turned off the heater fan and listened carefully. The sound seemed to come from outside, beyond the closed windows. I slowed down and lowered my window a crack. Cold air rushed in, making me shiver. The ringing became clearer. It was coming from above, from the wires strung between the poles. I frowned. That made no sense. Telephone wires do not ring by themselves. I looked up, but the wires were just thin lines against a gray sky. I could not see anything unusual. Still, the ringing continued, a light, persistent sound, as if carried by the wind. I closed the window and kept driving. Maybe there was an old phone box somewhere, or a wire touching something metal. I told myself it was nothing, but a few minutes later, the ringing stopped suddenly. Now I heard another sound. Voices. Very faint, hard to make out. I leaned forward, straining my ears. The voices were distant and muffled, as if traveling along the wires. I slowed down to a crawl, hoping to catch a word or two. It sounded like people talking quietly. I could not understand what they were saying. It was just a murmur, a soft conversation with no clear direction. My heart began to race. I felt sweat on my palms. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I told myself I was imagining things, maybe some radio interference or sound carried over the fields from a distant farmhouse. I rolled down my window again, halfway this time. The cold wind stung my face. The voices were still there, drifting in and out. I could not identify a language. Sometimes it sounded like English, sometimes like nonsense. I thought about stopping and checking the poles. But the idea of getting out alone in this empty place gave me chills. I saw no other cars, no buildings, no movement except the wires overhead. I decided to keep moving, hoping to leave this strange stretch behind. Maybe if I reached a more populated area, the sounds would disappear. As I continued, the voices grew louder, not loud enough to understand, but no longer a distant whisper. They seemed to follow me. I turned my head left and right, but I saw nothing but fields and a few barren trees. The wires overhead hummed softly. I tried turning on my radio to drown out the sounds. The radio produced static. I flipped through channels. Nothing clear, just crackling noises. I turned it off again. The sky darkened as afternoon wore on. I checked my phone. No signal, just the battery icon and an empty bar. The road had no signs, no markers. The poles continued in a straight line. I began to wonder if I took a wrong turn. But I had followed the only road available. I had to trust it would lead me somewhere eventually. The ringing started again, this time sharper. It sounded like a real telephone, an old rotary phone bell. It rang 3 times, then stopped. The voices resumed, a bit more agitated now. I could catch a word. Wait, another word. Listen, then static, like a weak radio station fading in and out. I rubbed my eyes, feeling a headache forming. This made no sense. I tried speaking aloud, just to break the tension. Hello? My voice sounded shaky. I felt silly talking to nobody, but I had to do something. Who's there? I asked. Of course, no one answered. The voices did not react. They just drifted along the wires, sometimes quiet, sometimes overlapping each other. I caught a snatch of laughter, then a cough, then a sigh. It felt like dozens of fragments of conversation spliced together. I pressed the accelerator, picking up speed. I wanted to escape this strange phenomenon. The faster I drove, the louder the murmur became. After a while, I realized something else. The wires on the poles did not seem to connect anywhere. They just stretched along the road as far as I could see. No cross streets, no junctions, no visible endpoints. It was as if they existed solely to carry these noises. The car's headlights illuminated patches of cracked asphalt and the bottoms of the poles. The wires overhead looked thin and fragile. I scanned the roadside for a phone booth or a service box. Nothing. Just wooden poles every few yards, identical and silent except for the voices drifting along. My stomach felt tight. I considered turning around. Maybe I had passed a turn without noticing, but I did not remember any intersections. The idea of going back through the same stretch made me uneasy. I decided to keep going forward. Sooner or later, I had to find a crossroads or a sign. As night fell, the temperature dropped. My windshield began to fog, and I turned on the defroster. The voices persisted, sometimes fading, sometimes rising. Every now and then, the ringing would return, 2 or 3 rings, then silence. I tried ignoring it. I focused on driving carefully. The road could be icy. The last thing I needed was to skid off into a ditch. After about an hour, I saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like a farmhouse porch light or a street lamp. My heart lifted. I drove faster, eager to reach a place where I could ask for directions or at least feel less alone. As I approached, I realized it was a small roadside structure, maybe an old maintenance shack. A single bulb above its door cast a weak glow on the snow. I pulled over and stopped the car. I left the engine running and stepped outside. The air was biting cold. My breath formed clouds. The voices were quieter now, but still present. The wires hummed overhead. I approached the shack. The door was closed, and a padlock hung from the latch. The window was dirty, but I could see inside, empty shelves, a chair, and some old tools. No phone lines connected, nothing useful. I kicked a lump of ice in frustration. My foot hurt. I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" My voice echoed. No response, just the distant murmur from above. I returned to my car, feeling more nervous. The shack offered no help. I decided to continue driving. I had to find a real road or a town. Back in the car, I rolled up the window and locked the doors. I turned the heater up. The voices seemed to intensify as I pulled back onto the road. This time, I caught another phrase. "Don't leave." It sounded garbled, like an old tape recording. My skin prickled. I gritted my teeth and kept driving. I would not let these strange noises stop me. A few miles later, the ringing started again, more urgently. It rang 5 or 6 times, then stopped. The voices overlapped, as if arguing or crying. I thought I heard sobbing, then laughter, then silence. My head ached. I tapped the steering wheel, my fingers numb inside my gloves. Suddenly, my headlights caught a figure on the side of the road. I gasped and hit the brakes. The car slowed on the slippery surface. I looked carefully. It was just a coat hanging from a pole. Someone had hung an old coat on a nail. The shape resembled a person at first glance, but it was just empty cloth flapping gently. I cursed under my breath. That was a cruel trick or a coincidence. I pressed on. My fuel gauge showed half a tank, enough for a few more hours. I prayed I would not need that long. The voices thinned out after a while. I heard only a faint static. Then, out of nowhere, a clear voice emerged. A woman's voice, calm and steady. "Can you hear me?" I slammed on the brakes again, my heart racing. The voice was so clear, as if inside the car. I looked around, but I was alone. The wires overhead vibrated slightly in the wind. "Who are you?" I shouted, feeling ridiculous. The voice did not reply. I waited, breathing hard. Then I heard a soft click, like a phone line disconnecting. Silence fell. The static faded. The wires hummed quietly. I waited a full minute, but no more voices came. I decided to keep driving. The silence felt eerie after all that noise. The road stretched ahead, still empty. Finally, after what felt like hours, I spotted a proper road sign. A green sign with white letters, pointing to a highway exit in a few miles. Relief washed over me. I picked up speed, leaving the wires behind. As I neared the junction, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. I could still see the line of poles receding into the darkness. The wires looked fragile and ancient. The noise had stopped completely now. No voices, no ringing, just the hum of my engine and the crunch of tires on old pavement. I turned onto the main road, which was well lit and maintained. I saw other cars in the distance. Civilization. I almost laughed with relief. I continued until I found a gas station with bright lights and a convenience store. I parked, got out, and stretched my legs. Inside, I bought a coffee and asked the clerk if he knew anything about that old road with the telephone poles. He shrugged and said he never took that route. He mentioned the main highway was clear now. I did not press the matter. I just nodded and sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth. Later, in a motel room, I thought about the voices. I could not explain them. Maybe it was some atmospheric phenomenon or old cables picking up radio signals. Maybe my mind played tricks on me in that lonely place. I never found out who hung that coat on the pole or why. I never discovered the source of that old-fashioned ringing or the whispers that drifted along the wires. I tried not to dwell on it. The next day I continued my journey on the main roads, surrounded by traffic, lights, and people. I felt safer. But I remember that deserted road, those cables overhead, and the strange sounds that followed me. I remember the tension in my shoulders, the dryness in my mouth, and the moment I heard a clear voice ask, "Can you hear me?" I do not want to experience that again. That's all I can say. I drove through a place that made no sense. I heard voices on the wind, carried along old telephone wires that led nowhere. I escaped and never went back. I prefer not to think about what it all meant. I just know it happened, and I moved on. I remember the day we decided to camp in that remote valley. There were 4 of us. We drove out early in the morning, leaving the city behind. The roads were empty. We talked about how peaceful it would be. We wanted to escape work, noise, and holiday stress. We found the spot on a map, not a well-known place. The idea was to stay a couple of nights, cook simple meals, and breathe fresh air. It was December, a few days before Christmas. The air was cold, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground. We were prepared with warm clothes, sleeping bags, and a decent tent. We parked the car at the edge of a rough trail and hiked in for about an hour. The valley was surrounded by low mountains and bare trees. The silence hit us. I noticed right away that it felt different from other campsites I had visited. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant streams. Just a heavy silence. It made my ears ring slightly. My friends commented on it, laughing a bit, but I saw uncertainty in their eyes. We picked a flat spot near a cluster of trees and set up our tent. It was a large tent that fit all 4 of us, side by side. We unrolled our sleeping bags, arranged our gear, and decided to gather some firewood. The snow crunched under our boots as we collected sticks and branches. The sky was cloudy, and the light was dim, even though it was still afternoon. We found enough wood and started a small fire. The smell of smoke felt reassuring. We cooked some instant noodles and ate quietly, sipping hot tea from thermoses. We tried talking, but the silence around us made us speak in low voices, as if we were intruding. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. The valley seemed too quiet. As the light faded, we huddled near the fire. Our breath formed small clouds. We had a lantern and some flashlights. The tent glowed softly from inside. The trees around us stood still, their branches heavy with old snow. One friend, Mark, mentioned he had no phone signal. The others checked their phones. No signal at all. We had expected that, but it still made us uneasy. We were truly alone out here. Night came quickly. We decided to turn in early and rest. We put out the fire but left a small pile of wood ready for the morning. Inside the tent, we zipped our sleeping bags up and lay there, listening to nothing. The silence pressed on my ears. I could hear my own heartbeat. The others shifted quietly, trying to get comfortable. We whispered a few jokes to lighten the mood. Eventually, we fell silent. I woke up after what felt like an hour. It was probably midnight. I heard a soft sound outside. I held my breath and listened. A faint whisper, maybe more than one voice, carried by no breeze. The tent walls blocked my view, but not the sound. It was not talking, more like a series of hushed tones. I turned my head and saw that my friends were awake too, their eyes wide in the darkness. One friend, Sarah, mouthed, "Do you hear that?" I nodded. We lay still, listening. The sound came in short bursts, then faded. Something like a low murmur or soft rustling. But there was no wind, no animals we could see. The temperature felt colder, and I noticed my toes were numb even inside the sleeping bag. Mark reached for a flashlight and clicked it on, aiming at the tent roof. The thin fabric glowed dimly. Outside, the whispering stopped. Silence again. We waited, muscles tense, not speaking. After several minutes, when nothing happened, we tried to sleep. It took a long time. Every small noise from inside the tent, a shifting leg or a cough, sounded too loud. I finally drifted off, but it was restless sleep. I woke again before dawn. Pale light seeped through the tent fabric. My back ached from the hard ground. I heard someone outside. I panicked for a moment, but realized it was Mark. He must have gone out to start the fire. I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled out. Sarah and the others were awake, rubbing their eyes. We dressed quickly and stepped outside. Mark stood by the place where we left our firewood. He looked confused. The wood pile was scattered. Some branches were snapped. Our small stack of supplies, an extra pot, a folding chair, was disturbed. Nothing was gone, just moved around, as if someone had rummaged through it. Mark said he found footprints, but when we looked closely, we only saw indentations in the snow that could have been from one of us. Still, we were sure we stacked the wood neatly. Now it was a mess. We felt uneasy. We checked our food bag. It was untouched. Our tent zippers were still closed. No one remembered hearing anyone walking around. We decided to focus on making breakfast. I restarted the fire using some dry kindling from the bottom of the pack. We boiled water for coffee. The heat felt good on our hands. We spoke quietly, trying to act normal. But we were all thinking the same thing. Who or what messed with our stuff? After breakfast, we discussed leaving early. The place felt wrong, but we had driven far and planned 2 nights. We were not quitters. Maybe it was just animals. Maybe the silence made us jumpy. We decided to stay one more night, but be more alert. We split up to explore a bit. Sarah and I walked a short distance downhill, following a narrow trail. Mark and Jake stayed near the camp. Sarah and I saw nothing unusual, just more trees, silent and still. No birds, no tracks, nothing. The snow muffled our footsteps, and our own breathing sounded loud. After half an hour, we returned to camp. Mark and Jake had found nothing either. The day passed slowly. We tried to talk, play cards, and read books. Without signal, we felt isolated. The silence never broke. No planes overhead, no distant cars, not even a breeze. That evening we made a bigger fire and stayed up later. We tried to keep a cheerful mood. Jake told a stupid joke. Mark laughed too loudly. Sarah forced a smile. I pretended not to notice their tension. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the cold air. We roasted some marshmallows. The sweetness felt good on my tongue. Still, in the back of my mind, I waited for something to happen. Eventually, we put out the fire and crawled into the tent again. We agreed to take turns staying awake, just in case. Mark volunteered first. He sat near the entrance with a flashlight and a pocket knife, just being cautious. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep deeply. I kept hearing that faint whisper from the previous night in my head. I must have drifted off for a bit. Suddenly, I felt Mark shaking my shoulder. He held a finger to his lips, telling me to be quiet. I heard it too. Soft, muffled voices just outside the tent. They did not sound friendly or hostile, just strange, unintelligible. My stomach clenched, and I could feel my heart pounding. We huddled together, all 4 of us awake now. The whispers moved around the tent, circling it slowly. We saw no shadows, no silhouettes, just the faint sound. Sarah bit her lip until it nearly bled. Jake held his breath, eyes wide. I gripped my flashlight, wondering if I should shine it outside. Mark gestured for us to stay still. Minutes passed like hours. The whispers faded, then stopped. We waited longer, not daring to move. Finally, Mark unzipped the tent a tiny bit and peeked out with the flashlight off. Nothing, just darkness and the faint shape of trees. He slowly turned on the flashlight and shone it around. The snow surface looked undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of anyone. We were shaking now. We agreed that at first light we would pack and leave. No one wanted to spend another minute here. The tent felt like a thin barrier against something unknown and unnerving. We zipped it shut and tried to stay alert, but exhaustion took its toll. One by one, we drifted into a nervous sleep. I woke before sunrise. My neck was stiff. The others stirred awake too. We wasted no time. We dressed quickly and stepped outside. The valley looked pale and empty in the early light. We moved fast, packing our gear, rolling sleeping bags, folding the tent. Our fingers were numb from the cold. I kept glancing around, expecting to see someone or something watching us. Once packed, we hiked back the way we came. Our footprints from 2 days ago were still visible, frozen in the snow. We followed them carefully. None of us spoke much. After an hour, we reached the car. The relief was overwhelming. I started the engine, cranked up the heater, and we left that valley behind. On the drive back, we tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the quiet playing tricks on our minds. Maybe we all imagined the whispers, but we all heard them, more than once. The disturbed supplies, the strange voices circling the tent at night, all with no footprints or visual confirmation. We could not explain it. We promised not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us? People would say it was the wind, animals, or our imagination. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt in that valley. The silence was not normal. It weighed on us, made every sound seem suspicious. I still feel uneasy when I think about it. As we approached the city, traffic sounds and lights felt comforting. We stopped at a diner and had coffee and warm food. The hum of people talking and dishes clinking relaxed us. No one mentioned the valley. We just chatted about other things, avoiding the subject. I have not gone camping since that trip. The others haven't either. We never openly agreed not to, but somehow we all know. That place changed something in us. The memory of those whispers in the silent valley still lingers. When I try to sleep on cold winter nights, I sometimes recall that absolute quiet, broken only by faint voices that had no source. It still makes my chest tighten. I am just glad we left when we did. I do not want to know what would have happened if we stayed another night. I remember noticing that door for the first time about a month after I moved in. I lived in an old apartment building with a small underground garage. It was a simple space, just enough spots for the tenants and some storage cages along the walls. At the far end, behind a couple of parked cars and some stacked boxes, I saw a door with a sign that said restricted access. I had never noticed it before. The paint on the sign was faded, and the door looked older than the rest of the building. The first time I saw it, I just shrugged. I assumed it led to some maintenance area or a closed-off section of the basement. I had no reason to be curious. The building superintendent never mentioned it. I went back upstairs to my apartment and forgot about it. A few days later, I was in the elevator with a neighbor who mentioned the building's age. He said some parts were no longer in use. I asked if he knew what was behind that restricted access door in the basement. He just shook his head and said he had never paid attention. We reached our floor, and that was it. One night, I came home late, around midnight. I parked my car in my usual spot and headed for the elevator. The basement was quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. As I approached the elevator, I heard a muffled sound. It was soft, like someone moving furniture or dragging something. I paused and listened. It seemed to come from the far corner where that door was. I walked slowly toward it, feeling a slight chill on my neck. The door looked normal, just old wooden panels with chipped paint, a simple metal handle with no keyhole. I pressed my ear against it. I heard a faint scraping noise. Then it stopped. My heart beat a little faster. I considered knocking, but decided against it. I didn't want to explain myself if someone inside got angry. I backed away and took the elevator upstairs. Over the next week, I tried to ignore it. But now that I had noticed the door and the noises, I became more aware of them. Late at night, when I returned home, I often heard soft sounds coming from behind that door. Not every night, but often enough to bother me. Sometimes it was a gentle scraping, other times a quiet thump. Once I thought I heard a low sigh or moan, but it could have been the pipes or my imagination. I asked the superintendent about it one morning. He looked confused. "Restricted access door?" he repeated, scratching his head. He claimed he had no idea what I was talking about. Maybe he just didn't remember. He said he would check. Days passed, and he never mentioned it again. I didn't push it. He seemed busy and disinterested. One evening, I decided to investigate more carefully. I made sure no one was in the garage. It was about 11 p.m. I parked and walked straight to the door. The air in the basement felt stale and heavy. I stood in front of the door and tried the handle. It was locked. I looked around for any keyholes or padlocks, but saw nothing. The handle wouldn't budge. I pushed lightly, then harder. It did not move. I listened. At first, silence. Then I heard a soft shuffling sound, like feet dragging on concrete. My heart picked up speed. I felt sweat on my palms. I knelt down and tried to see if there was any gap underneath. There was a thin slit at the bottom, but too dark and narrow to see through. I smelled dust and dampness. I tapped on the door lightly. No response. I tapped again, a bit louder. The shuffling stopped. I stood up, feeling uneasy. I went upstairs, locked my apartment door, and sat on my couch thinking about it. Who could be in there at that hour? Why was it never mentioned in the lease or the building info? I felt stupid for getting worked up over a door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few nights, I tried different approaches. One time, I got home a bit earlier and waited in my car with the engine off, lights out. I watched the door from a distance. The garage lights were dim, and the only sounds were my breathing and the hum of the ventilation. After half an hour, I saw no one enter or leave the door. No sounds, nothing. When I finally got out and approached, I heard a faint scraping again, as if triggered by my presence. Another night I placed my phone near the door and recorded audio for a few minutes. When I played it back upstairs, I heard faint thumps and what sounded like a chair being moved, but it was too unclear. Could be anything. I started feeling uneasy in my own building. I locked my apartment door at all times. I checked the peephole whenever I heard anyone in the hall. At night, I tried to sleep, but I kept imagining what could be behind that door. Was it a storage room someone was using secretly? A maintenance area where a squatter lived? The building was old, maybe there were hidden rooms. But why the strange sounds so late? I decided to talk to another neighbor I trusted, a middle-aged woman who had lived there for a decade. She shrugged and said she knew of no such door. I described its location precisely. She seemed surprised and said she had never noticed a door there. That made no sense. The door was quite visible if you walked to the back of the garage. Had everyone just ignored it? I needed more evidence. One evening, I brought a small flashlight. I examined the frame of the door closely. The wood looked worn, as if very old. The hinges were on the inside. I couldn't see them. The door fitted the frame tightly. No easy way to pry it open. I tried knocking again, this time more firmly. "Hello?" I said, my voice low and tense. Silence. Then a soft scratch, as if fingernails scraping the wood from the inside. I jumped back, heart pounding. I rushed to the elevator, feeling a burst of panic. That sound was too deliberate. I got to my apartment, locked the door, and paced around. Should I call the police? What would I say? There's a weird door in my building's basement making noises. They'd think I was nuts. I decided to wait and see if the superintendent would take action. A few days later, the superintendent told me he checked the basement and saw no door with such a sign. I insisted. He looked at me with confusion and maybe suspicion. He said maybe I was mistaken. After that, I tried to show him, but whenever I looked for him, he was busy or not around. I began to think maybe I was losing it, but I knew the door was there. I had touched it, tried the handle. I took photos with my phone. At night, I snapped a few pictures of the door. In the photos, it showed up clearly. I felt relieved I had proof. The next day, I tried to show the photos to the superintendent. He looked at them and frowned, said the lighting was poor, and he couldn't make out what it was. He gave me a vague promise to investigate more thoroughly. I knew he wouldn't. Now I was sure something strange was happening. Why would the superintendent pretend not to know? Maybe he was involved somehow. I started feeling watched. In the hallways, I thought I saw people glance at me strangely. Maybe I was just paranoid, but the tension was real. My stomach knotted every time I went down to park my car. One night, I decided to confront the situation more directly. I brought a crowbar from my trunk. I parked my car facing the door, headlights off, but ready to flash them if needed. I approached the door with the crowbar hidden in my jacket. My heart hammered in my chest. My breathing was fast and shallow. I grabbed the handle and pulled hard. No movement. I wedged the crowbar's tip at the edge of the door and tried to pry it. The wood creaked but didn't give. Then I heard a voice, very faint, from behind the door. It sounded like a whisper of my name. My name. I froze. The hair on my arms stood up. I swallowed hard and tried again, pushing the crowbar. The door rattled slightly, dust falling from the frame. A sudden thump from inside made me jump back. The doorknob twisted, but only a tiny bit. I saw it move. I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was trying to open it from the other side. I stumbled backward, dropping the crowbar. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the crowbar again, shining my flashlight at the door. The knob was still now. No movement. The whispering stopped. I couldn't handle it. I rushed back to the elevator and went upstairs, locking myself in. That night, I barely slept. I turned on the TV to drown out my thoughts, but nothing helped. I wondered if I should contact the police or maybe move out. It was insane. Who or what knew my name from behind that door? The next morning, I checked the basement in daylight. The door was there, silent and still. No signs of forced entry. The crowbar had left a small scratch on the frame. I touched the door lightly. It felt cold. I stood there for a minute, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. The daytime silence felt safer. I made up my mind to call the police that evening. But when I got home from work, there was a note under my apartment door. It was typed with no signature. It said, "Please stop trying to open the basement door." That's all. No threats, just a request. My hands trembled as I read it. Someone knew I had tried. Someone watched me. I threw the note away and locked my door. I called the police's non-emergency line. I said there was a suspicious locked door in my building with noises behind it. The officer on the phone seemed puzzled. He said without evidence of a crime, they couldn't do much. I mentioned the strange note, and he suggested I speak to the building management or hire a locksmith. He didn't seem to take me seriously. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights off, thinking. I realized I had no easy way out. The building's management ignored me. The police wouldn't help. The neighbors seemed oblivious. The superintendent acted as if the door didn't exist. Something was going on that no one wanted to acknowledge. I felt trapped and isolated. I considered moving out, but my lease had months left, and breaking it would be expensive. Yet the idea of staying near that door, that thing whispering my name, made me sick. I decided to avoid the basement whenever possible. I could walk from the street if I parked outside. It was inconvenient, but safer. For several days, I avoided the basement. I parked on the street and entered through the front lobby. Each time I passed near the elevator that led to the basement, I felt a knot in my stomach. I forced myself not to go down there. But one night, after a late shift, there was no street parking available. I had to park in the garage. It was past midnight again. I stepped out of my car and felt the silence of the basement. I tried not to look at the door. I pressed the elevator button, my back turned to it. My neck prickled as if something was behind me. I heard a faint scrape. I closed my eyes, pretending not to hear. The elevator arrived, and I hurried in, pressing my floor button. As the doors closed, I looked over my shoulder. The door stood there, dark and still, but I swore I saw a shadow move away from it. In the weeks that followed, I heard no more whispers. I avoided late nights when possible. I never tried to open the door again. The superintendent never mentioned anything. The neighbors remained silent. It was as if the door and its noises were my private nightmare. Maybe it gave up after I stopped trying. I never discovered what was behind it. Eventually, I moved out when my lease ended. I told no one about the door when I left. I took my things and never looked back. But I still remember the sound of that whisper and the feeling of that locked handle that would not budge. I remember the note and the way the superintendent pretended it didn't exist. Whatever was behind that restricted access door remains a mystery, and I'm just glad I'm not there anymore. I remember that night because it felt strange from the moment I pulled off the main road. It was late December, close to Christmas. The sky was dark, and a light snowfall blurred the edges of the old highway. I had been driving for hours and needed something warm to drink. My car's headlights caught a faded sign, a roadside cafe just ahead. I had not seen any other stops for miles, so I took the exit. The tires made a crunching sound over icy patches. I pulled into a small lot next to the cafe. The building was old and simple, with a dull sign that read "Cafe" in worn lettering. No lights flashed, no other cars parked. The windows were dark, but not completely. I thought I saw a faint glow inside. I turned off my engine and listened. The night air was silent, except for the distant hum of wind. I wrapped my scarf tighter and stepped out. My breath showed in the cold air. I checked my phone. No signal. Fine. I just needed coffee and maybe a snack. I approached the entrance. A small bell hung above the door, dusty and rusted. I pushed the door gently. It opened without resistance. The inside smelled stale but not rotten. It reminded me of old carpet and damp wood. I expected to see someone behind the counter, but no one was there. Just empty chairs, a few tables, and a single counter with a register. A row of coffee pots and a small display case for pastries stood on the back wall. Everything looked old and a bit neglected. I noticed some Christmas decorations scattered around, an old wreath, a few strings of lights that were not turned on. It felt like someone had tried to decorate a long time ago and then gave up. I stepped closer to the counter. A bell sat there, a small metal one you tap to call for service. I tapped it once, softly. The sound echoed more than I expected. I waited. Nothing happened. I tapped it again, louder. Still no one appeared. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded flat in the empty room. No answer. I leaned over the counter, trying to see if there was a kitchen or back room. A curtain hung behind the register, blocking my view. I felt uneasy. It was strange that the door was unlocked, but no one was around. The coffee pots were all off, cold and empty. I checked the pastry case. Inside, a few stale-looking muffins and cookies sat on a tray. They did not look fresh. I knocked on the counter again, feeling more nervous. The silence pressed on my ears. I considered leaving, but I really wanted coffee, and this was the only place for who knows how many miles. Maybe the owner stepped out. I decided to wait a bit. I walked around, looking at the tables. Dust covered most surfaces. One table had a napkin crumpled on it, as if someone left in a hurry. Another had an empty sugar packet. The floor creaked under my boots. I noticed the heating was barely on. The inside felt almost as cold as outside. I tried calling out again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" My voice sounded sharp. I listened carefully. For a moment I thought I heard something. A quiet shuffle, maybe from behind the curtain. I moved back to the counter and tapped the bell again, 3 times, fast. The sound made me jump. Still no one came. I looked around, feeling a tightness in my chest. This was not normal. A roadside cafe might be quiet at night, but not this empty and unstaffed. I sighed and decided to check the back room. I walked around the counter, feeling a slight fear twist in my stomach. I pushed aside the curtain. Behind it, I saw a small hallway leading to a door marked "Staff Only." The hallway was dim, lit only by a weak overhead bulb. The door at the end was closed. I approached the door, my footsteps slow. My heart beat faster. I knocked on it softly. The sound of my knuckles on the wood felt too loud. "Hello?" I said again. My mouth was dry, no response. The silence grew heavier. My skin felt prickly under my coat. I turned back to the main area. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there. Maybe I hoped to find a note or a sign explaining where the staff went. I walked behind the counter, checking drawers and shelves. Nothing but old receipts, some sugar packets, empty coffee filters. The register was off. I saw a paper taped on the wall with scribbled handwriting. Some inventory list, maybe. Nothing useful. I glanced at the door. Snow was still falling outside. I did not relish getting back on the icy road without something warm. I decided to help myself. The coffee machines looked like old electric percolators. I tried flipping a switch on one. No response. Maybe the power outlets were turned off. I knelt down to check. The plugs were in place, but the machine looked dusty and unused. I tapped it. It rattled dully, probably broken. I tried another machine. Same result. No coffee tonight. I felt frustrated and a bit scared. Why was this place open with no one around? No working equipment, nothing fresh. I considered the possibility that someone was playing a prank, or maybe the owner had stepped out and got stuck in the snow. It did not make sense. I returned to the dining area. The silence got under my skin. I could hear my own breathing. the rustle of my coat when I moved. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I cursed under my breath. I wanted to leave, but now my curiosity was stronger. I decided to look around outside, maybe check if there was a house nearby or another door. I stepped back outside. The cold air hit my face. The parking lot was empty except for my car. The highway stretched into darkness. No headlights, no distant engine noises. I walked around the building. On one side, I saw a door with a small sign, "Employees Only." I tried the handle, locked. I peeked through a window. Inside, just a dark corridor, maybe the same one I saw from the inside. No movement. I continued walking. Behind the cafe, I found a small shed. The door was ajar. I shone my phone's flashlight inside. Just old junk, broken chairs, crates, nothing special. I called out again, "Hello?" My voice sounded hollow. I felt more foolish each time I asked. No one answered. I walked around the other side and ended up back at the front. Snow had started to stick more heavily to the ground. I wiped my boots on the mat and went in again. The door's little bell made a weak clink. Inside, the atmosphere felt even heavier. My pulse thumped in my ears. I approached the curtain behind the counter once more. This time, I heard a sound. It was very faint, like a soft whisper or a sigh. I froze, leaning forward, straining to listen. The sound came again, maybe two voices whispering. I couldn't make out words. My throat tightened. I stepped through the curtain into the hallway. The bulb flickered slightly. I stood still, holding my breath. The whispering faded. The staff-only door remained closed. I tried the handle, locked. I pressed my ear against it, feeling the cool wood against my cheek. Silence inside. I backed away slowly. My legs felt weak. I returned to the dining area, unsure what to do. That's when I noticed something odd. The bell on the counter. I had left it facing one way, but now it seemed turned slightly. I could not be sure, but it felt different. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Had someone come in when I was outside? I grabbed the bell and shook it hard, producing a loud ringing. "Hello, is anyone here? I just want a coffee," my voice echoed. No answer. I slammed the bell on the counter, anger mixing with fear. This was insane. I decided to leave. No coffee, no staff, just get back on the road. I walked to the door. My hand touched the handle. Then I heard a scraping sound behind me. I turned quickly. The curtain behind the counter moved slightly, as if someone brushed it from the other side. I froze, staring. The curtain settled. No one emerged. My heart hammered. I wanted to say something, but no words came out. I took a step forward, then stopped myself. I didn't want to go back there again. I already tried. Whoever was there did not want to show themselves. I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm leaving now," I said. "If you need help, I'm sorry, but I have to go." Silence. I backed towards the door, not taking my eyes off the counter area. I reached the door and pushed it open. The cold air rushed in. I stepped outside, breathing fast. The snow had piled up more, making the parking lot a white sheet. I hurried to my car. I clicked the remote, opened the door, and jumped in. I turned the key, and the engine struggled for a second before starting. I glanced at the cafe. Through the window, I saw the dim interior. For a split second, I thought I saw movement near the back, a shape passing in front of the weak light. I could not be sure. I put the car in gear and rolled out onto the highway, careful not to skid on ice. My hands shook on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The cafe's sign faded behind me, its dull glow disappearing into the night. The road was empty. No headlights, no other travelers. Just my car and the sound of the engine. My chest felt tight for a long time. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe the owner had abandoned the place. Maybe someone was squatting there, too shy or scared to come out. Maybe it was just empty and my mind played tricks on me. But I knew what I heard: faint whispers, soft movements, and that note of old coffee and stale pastries left to sit untouched. I drove for another hour before I found a gas station with a small convenience store. I parked and went inside, grateful for the bright lights and the clerk's tired, normal face. I bought a coffee from an automated machine and a snack bar. The coffee tasted bitter and artificial, but at least it was real and hot. I asked the clerk if he knew about a cafe down the road. He shrugged and said he wasn't familiar with that area. Not many travelers came through this late. I said nothing else. I sipped my coffee and leaned against the counter, calming down. The smell of gasoline and plastic wrappers felt more real than anything in that cafe. After a while, I got back in my car and continued my journey, determined not to stop at any deserted places again. I never found out what was going on in that cafe. I never reported it. I never saw it again. Maybe if I passed by in daylight, I would see a boarded-up building or a for-sale sign. But I never went that way again. The memory still bothers me sometimes. A quiet cafe, no staff, faint whispers, and a door that no one would open. I'm just glad I left when I did, before anything worse could happen. I was driving my rig down Highway 50, cutting through Nevada. The loneliest road in America, they call it. It was late December, and a cold snap had left the ground frozen solid. Snow dusted the shoulders of the highway, but the road itself was clear enough. I had a trailer full of holiday decorations, heading for a big box store in Reno. The dispatcher said to get it there by morning, so I planned to drive through the night. The cab was warm, the heater humming steadily. The radio struggled to hold a signal, so I settled for static and the occasional garbled Christmas tune. There wasn't another soul on the road. No headlights ahead, no taillights behind. Just me, the truck, and the endless blacktop. About an hour in, I caught a flicker of light in my rear-view mirror. A single pair of headlights, far back but gaining on me. They weren't there a moment ago. I figured it was another driver catching up, maybe someone as desperate as I was to beat the holiday rush. No big deal. The car stayed back, though. It didn't pass, didn't get close enough to tailgate. Just hung there, maybe 50 yards behind. I adjusted my mirrors and checked again. The lights were steady, but something about them bothered me. They were old-fashioned, dimmer than modern LEDs, and they had a yellowish tint. Looked like something off a car built in the 70s. I focused on the road ahead, trying to shake the creeping unease. I had to keep my eyes on the road. Black ice was a real risk in weather like this. But every so often, I'd glance at the rear view. The lights were still there, always the same distance behind me. I flipped the radio dial again. Found a station playing static-filled Christmas carols. The words were barely audible, but I left it on to drown out the hum of the engine. The car's lights reflected faintly in my side mirrors. It felt like they were staring at me. About 20 miles later, I decided to pull over. There was a rest stop up ahead, a small place with vending machines and a bathroom, the kind of spot where you could stretch your legs, but not much else. I pulled into the lot, parked the truck, and waited. The car passed by slowly, headlights sweeping across my windshield. It was an old sedan, maybe a Buick, its paint dull and rust creeping along the edges. It didn't stop. Relieved, I climbed down from the cab and stood in the cold for a moment. The air was sharp, biting at my face and fingers. I stretched, grabbed a coffee from the vending machine, and leaned against the truck. The highway was dead quiet again. After 10 minutes, I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and rolled back onto the road. The stretch ahead was even darker now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The heater struggled to keep the cab warm as the temperature dropped. I rubbed my hands together and focused on the white lines ahead. Not 5 minutes later, the headlights reappeared. My stomach tightened. The same car, same dim yellow lights. It had pulled off somewhere and waited for me. I shook my head. Just a coincidence, I muttered aloud. Maybe the guy needed a rest too. Maybe he was heading to Reno like me. I didn't believe it, but I had to tell myself something. This time, the car got closer. Not close enough to pass, but close enough to fill my mirrors. I could see the grille now, the way it seemed to sag like the car was tired. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. I slowed down slightly, hoping they'd pass, but the car slowed down too. I sped up, and so did they. My pulse picked up. I could feel it in my neck, a steady thud, thud, thud. I reached for the CB radio. Anyone out there on 50 westbound? Got a tail that won't quit. Static answered me. No other drivers. No response. The car stayed with me for another 10 miles. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned off its headlights. I stared into the rear view. Nothing but darkness. My heart was hammering now. I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting the car to reappear out of nowhere. But the road stayed empty. For a while I thought maybe that was it. Maybe they'd turned off onto some dirt road or a private drive. I forced myself to relax, loosening my grip on the wheel. My knuckles were stiff, my fingers aching from holding on so tight. Then the CB crackled. A voice, faint and garbled, came through the speaker. "Keep going, driver." I stared at the radio. My hand hovered over the mic, but I didn't pick it up. The voice repeated, clearer this time. "Don't stop. Just keep going." I grabbed the mic. "Who the hell is this?" Silence. Static buzzed through the speaker, and then the voice was gone. My skin crawled. I tried to focus on driving, but my eyes kept darting to the mirrors. I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement on the side of the road, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just snow and shadows. Another 10 miles, and the headlights came back. This time, they were ahead of me. The car was parked on the shoulder, its taillights glowing faintly in the dark. As I approached, I could see the outline of the car more clearly. The driver's side door was open, but I didn't see anyone inside. The road was too narrow to stop, so I kept going, my eyes fixed on the car as I passed. It felt like something was watching me. The car's headlights flicked on as I passed, flooding my mirrors with yellow light. It pulled back onto the road, keeping pace with me again. My hands were sweating now, even in the cold. I couldn't stop shaking. I pressed the gas, pushing the truck faster than I usually would. The trailer rattled behind me, and the wind screamed against the cab. The car matched my speed, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see the driver. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Up ahead, I saw a sign for a truck weigh station. The lights were on, and there were other vehicles parked in the lot. Relief washed over me. I turned off the highway and pulled into the station, parking near a row of other rigs. The car didn't follow. I climbed out of the cab, my legs trembling as I hit the ground. I walked toward the weigh station's office, hoping someone inside could help me. As I reached the door, I glanced back at the highway. The car was parked on the shoulder, its headlights off. I could just make out its shape, sitting there like a predator waiting for its prey. Inside the office, the attendant looked up from his desk. "Everything okay?" I nodded, though my voice was shaky. "Yeah, just needed a break." I stayed at the weigh station for an hour, sipping coffee and trying to calm down. When I finally got back on the road, the car was gone. The rest of the drive was quiet, uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those headlights again. Every time I drive at night, I hear that voice on the CB. Keep going, driver. I moved into the house on December 23rd. It was a rental, cheap and fully furnished. Too good to be true, maybe, but I needed a place fast. My lease was up, and my landlord had already found someone else to take my old apartment. The village seemed nice, quiet, clean, friendly enough when I signed the paperwork, but when I got there, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was how dark it was. No Christmas lights, no wreaths, no inflatable Santas, nothing. It was like the whole village had skipped Christmas. Every other town I'd passed on the drive was decked out, but here, just bare streets and dim porch lights. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't much for decorations anyway. The house was cold when I walked in. Not just chilly, cold, like it hadn't been heated in weeks. I turned on the radiators and waited for them to hum to life. They were slow, groaning like they didn't want to work. I unpacked a few things and made some tea to warm up. The kitchen smelled musty, like old wood and damp fabric. The fridge was clean but empty, so I figured I'd go to the store the next day. By the time the heat finally kicked in, it was late. I was tired, so I locked the doors, checked the windows, and went upstairs. The bed was old but sturdy, with sheets that smelled faintly of detergent. I climbed in, turned off the light, and fell asleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. The house was dead silent. Not a creak, not a gust of wind outside, just silence. It was strange. Old houses make noise, floors creak, pipes rattle. Something always moves. But here, nothing. My ears strained against it, like they were searching for a sound that wasn't there. I told myself to go back to sleep, rolled over, closed my eyes. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps coming from downstairs. My stomach clenched. The sound was faint, like someone trying not to be heard, but it was there. Step, pause, step, pause. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped at the base of the stairs. I reached for my phone. No signal. Of course. I cursed under my breath, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. Call out? Stay quiet? I sat frozen, staring at the dark doorway, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After what felt like forever, I got up. My legs were shaking as I crept to the door. I peered into the hallway. Empty. I stepped out, careful not to make a sound, and moved toward the stairs. The wooden floor felt cold under my feet. My hand gripped the banister as I leaned forward, trying to see the bottom of the stairs. It was too dark. I couldn't see a thing. I stood there for a while, listening. The house was silent again. No footsteps, no movement. Finally, I told myself I was imagining things. It was a new place. I wasn't used to the sounds yet. Maybe the pipes had knocked, or the floorboards had shifted. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went downstairs. Everything looked normal. The front door was still locked, the windows were secure, nothing was out of place. I shook off the night as nerves and spent the day unpacking. I even drove into town for groceries. The store was small, but had everything I needed. The cashier was polite but distant, barely looking at me as she rang up my things. "You new in town?" she asked finally. "Yeah, moved in yesterday." She nodded, bagging the last of my items. "Which house?" I told her. Her hands froze mid-movement. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she blinked, shook her head, and handed me the bag. "Have a good day." On the drive back, I couldn't shake the way she'd looked at me, like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. I almost turned around to ask her what she knew, but I didn't. It felt silly. Small towns always had their quirks. Maybe the house had a bad reputation. Maybe someone died there and people were superstitious. It didn't matter. I wasn't staying long, just a few months, tops. That night, the footsteps came back. I was lying in bed, trying to read, when I heard them. Same as before. Slow, deliberate steps, moving through the house. This time, they didn't stop at the stairs. They climbed them. I froze, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The steps were soft, almost gentle, but they were coming closer. I stared at the door, willing it to stay shut. The steps reached the top of the stairs. They stopped. I waited, gripping the edge of the blanket like it was a shield. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then the doorknob turned. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The door didn't open, but the knob twisted, rattling slightly. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "I'm calling the police." The knob stilled. The silence returned. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, holding the lamp, watching the door. Every creak, every groan of the house set my nerves on edge. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled downstairs, exhausted and jittery. I checked the locks again. Still secure, no sign of a break-in. That day, I called the rental agency, told them I wanted out of the lease. The woman on the other end sounded surprised. "Is something wrong with the house?" I hesitated. What could I say? That it was haunted? That I was hearing things? I didn't want to sound crazy. "It's not what I expected," I said finally. "I'd like to move." She sighed. "I'm sorry, but the lease is binding for 6 months. If there's an issue, I can send someone out to inspect." "No, it's fine," I muttered, and hung up. That night, I decided to stay downstairs. I didn't want to be trapped in that bedroom again. I sat up on the couch, wrapped in blankets, a flashlight and kitchen knife by my side. The house was quiet at first, just the sound of the wind outside. I started to think maybe it was over. Then I saw it. The Christmas tree in the corner. I hadn't put it there. It hadn't been there when I came in. But now it was, fully decorated, with lights that flickered softly in the dark. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even bought a tree, let alone set one up. I stared at it, my pulse racing. Then the lights blinked off. The room plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When I clicked it on, the beam cut through the dark, illuminating the tree. The ornaments were gone. The branches were bare, except for a single figure sitting at the base, a small porcelain angel staring directly at me. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The angel didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. I didn't stop running until I was in the car, the engine roaring to life. As I sped down the empty streets, I looked back at the house. The windows were lit, and in each one, I saw the faint outline of figures standing there, watching me go. I thought a winter hike would be a good idea. It had been a rough December, and I needed a break from the city, the noise, and all the holiday chaos. The trail was remote but manageable, just a couple of miles into the woods and back. Snow had fallen the night before, leaving everything covered in a clean white layer, peaceful. quiet. I parked my car in the empty lot, laced up my boots, and started walking. The air was sharp and cold. Each breath felt like needles in my lungs. My boots crunched on the fresh snow, the only sound around. The trail markers were easy to spot. Red blazes painted on the trees every few yards. I had my backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight. No need for anything fancy. It was supposed to be a quick hike. About a mile in, I noticed the first set of tracks, small, like a child's, zigzagging across the trail, barefoot. My first thought was that someone was messing around. Who lets their kid run around in the snow without shoes? The tracks weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I figured they'd been made earlier in the morning. I kept walking. The tracks continued, weaving back and forth. They didn't follow the trail exactly, but they never strayed too far. I tried not to think about it. Maybe someone thought it was funny, or weird art. I don't know. The wind picked up, cutting through my jacket. I pulled my scarf tighter and shoved my hands in my pockets. The woods were dense here, the trees tall and heavy with snow. It felt darker than it should have been, even though it was still early afternoon. That's when I found the hat. It was hanging from a low branch, bright red, like something out of a Christmas movie. A Santa hat, cheap and worn, the kind you'd buy at a dollar store. It dangled there, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stopped and stared at it for a minute. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. Nothing, just the wind. I didn't touch the hat. It felt wrong, like I'd be crossing some line if I did. Instead, I kept walking, my pace a little quicker now. I told myself it was nothing, just someone being weird. But the tracks continued, now more erratic, like whoever made them was running or stumbling. A few hundred yards later, I found the first toy. A plastic car, half buried in the snow. The kind a toddler might play with. It was blue, with chipped paint and a missing wheel. I crouched down and brushed off the snow. It was cold and wet, like it hadn't been there long. I straightened up, my heart pounding now. Something wasn't right. The tracks, the hat, the toy, it all felt wrong, like I was following a trail I wasn't supposed to. The forest got quieter as I moved deeper in. No birds, no animals. Just the wind and the sound of my boots crunching through the snow. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. There was never anyone there. Then the trees opened up into a small clearing. In the center was a wooden cabin, old and weathered, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It wasn't on the map. I hadn't seen any signs or markings that mentioned it. The snow around the cabin was trampled, like there'd been a lot of activity recently. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to turn around and leave, but the tracks led right up to the door. Whoever had been walking barefoot in the snow had gone inside. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. No answer. I took a step forward, then another. My boots sank into the snow, the sound muffled now. The cabin didn't look abandoned. The wood was rough but intact, the windows fogged over from the heat inside. I could hear something faint, movement, a voice. It was hard to tell over the wind. I reached the door and knocked. 3 quick raps, my knuckles stinging from the cold. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" Nothing. I tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The smell of burning wood filled the air, mixed with something sweet like cinnamon. "Hello?" I said again, stepping inside. My voice felt small in the space. The room was simple. A table with 2 chairs, a shelf lined with jars and cans, and a cot pushed up against the far wall. On the table was a plate with half-eaten cookies and a mug of something steaming, fresh. Someone had been here recently. Then I saw it. In the corner, near the cot, was a pile of toys. Dolls, trucks, stuffed animals. Some old, some new. All arranged neatly, like they'd been placed there with care. And next to them, on the floor, were the same barefoot tracks, leading to the cot and stopping. The air in the cabin felt heavier now. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. I backed toward the door, my boots squeaking on the wooden floor. I didn't want to turn my back on the room. It felt like something was watching me. The door slammed shut. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The room was empty, but the air had changed. Warmer, closer. The fire crackled louder, the shadows on the walls seeming to grow and twist. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I'm just passing through. I don't want any trouble." No answer, just the fire and the wind outside. I grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, throwing my weight into it, but it was like it had fused to the frame. My breath came in short gasps now, fogging up the cold air around me. Behind me, the floor creaked. I froze. Slowly, I turned around. The toys were scattered now, no longer in their neat pile. The cot was empty, but the footprints were back, leading from the corner to the center of the room. And standing there, in the middle of the floor, was the red Santa hat. It hadn't been there before. I didn't think. I grabbed the closest thing, a chair, and swung it at the window. The glass shattered, and cold air rushed in. I climbed through, cutting my hands on the broken edges, and dropped into the snow outside. I ran. I didn't stop to look back, didn't care about the pain in my hands or the cold biting at my face. The trail markers were harder to see now, the light fading fast. But I didn't care. I just kept moving. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out, the tires slipping on the icy pavement. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was gone. The clearing was empty, just a patch of undisturbed snow where it had been. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But I haven't been back since, and I never will. Started on Christmas Eve, during my night shift. Driving my car through the snow-covered streets of the city, I'd picked up fares all evening. Holiday parties, last-minute shoppers, the occasional drunk trying to get home. It was the usual routine for a rideshare driver, except for the cold. The city felt colder than ever. Streets were nearly empty, except for a few cabs and bundled-up stragglers rushing to wherever they were going. The shift had been uneventful until I got the ping. A pickup request from a quiet residential street just outside downtown. The profile had no picture, just the name Chris. I accepted. It was better than sitting around waiting. When I pulled up, the street was deserted. No one was outside. Snow fell steadily, and the wind howled between the houses. I glanced at the app. It said they were here. I checked the mirrors and looked around, but no one came. I rolled the window down slightly and called out, "Chris?" Nothing, just the sound of the wind. I was about to cancel the ride when I saw someone step out from behind a parked car. A man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around his face. He didn't hurry, just walked toward the car, his boots crunching in the snow. When he got close, he opened the back door and slid in without saying a word. "Chris?" I asked. He nodded, his scarf still covering most of his face. "Yeah, thanks." His voice was muffled, low. I shrugged and started the ride. The destination was an address on the other side of town, a neighborhood I didn't know well. It wasn't far, but the streets were slick with ice, and I had to take it slow. For the first few minutes, we didn't talk. I focused on the road while he sat in the back, quiet. I could see his reflection in the rear-view mirror, just the outline of his head and shoulders. He didn't move much, didn't fidget or check his phone like most passengers, just sat there, staring out the window. Then he reached out and drew something on the glass. His glove left a smudged mark, but I couldn't tell what it was. I glanced at him in the mirror. "You okay back there?" I asked. He didn't answer, just kept drawing on the fogged-up window, his movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even though his face was turned away. The ride felt longer than it should have. The streets were too quiet, the city too dark. Every so often I glanced at the rear-view mirror. He was still drawing, his hand moving in steady patterns. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "What are you drawing?" He stopped. His hand dropped to his lap and he looked up, meeting my eyes in the mirror. His scarf had shifted slightly, enough for me to see his mouth. He was smiling. "You'll see," he said. That was it, just those 2 words. My stomach tightened. I gripped the wheel harder, my knuckles going white. I wanted to say something, to tell him to knock it off, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, the address came into view. It was an old house, the kind you'd expect to see in a Christmas card. Snow-covered roof, icicles hanging from the gutters, a wreath on the door. The windows were dark, no lights inside. It didn't look like anyone was home. "This it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He didn't answer. I turned to look at him, but the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. I hadn't heard him leave. He was just gone. I stared at the seat, my heart pounding. Then I looked at the window he'd been drawing on. The smudges were still there, but now I could see what he'd written. 3 words, scrawled backwards so I could read them from the driver's seat. "Don't go home." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My mouth went dry. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Was it a joke? Some kind of prank? But how had he gotten out of the car without me noticing? I didn't wait to find out. I threw the car into gear and drove off, the tires slipping on the icy road. I needed to get away from that house, from that street, from whatever had just happened. The next fare came through almost immediately, a pickup at a diner a few miles away. I didn't want to take it, but I needed the distraction, needed something to shake the feeling crawling under my skin. When I pulled into the diner lot, a woman was standing outside, bundled up against the cold. She waved and climbed into the back seat, smiling. "Hi, thanks for coming out in this weather," she said. Her voice was warm, cheerful, normal. I felt myself relax a little. "No problem," I said. "Where to?" She gave me an address, and we set off. For the first few minutes, we made small talk. She told me about her family, how they were visiting for Christmas. I nodded along, grateful for the normalcy. Then she stopped talking. I glanced in the mirror. She was staring out the window, her face pale. "You okay?" I asked. "There's writing on the window," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My stomach dropped. I didn't look. I couldn't. "What does it say?" I asked, my throat tight. She hesitated, then leaned closer to the glass. Her breath fogged it up as she read the words aloud. "Don't stop." I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt in the middle of the road, the tires crunching on the snow. I twisted around in my seat, staring at the window. The words were there, clear as day. They hadn't been there when I picked her up. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. I don't know how that got there." She grabbed her bag and got out of the car. slamming the door behind her. I watched her stomp off into the night, her figure disappearing into the falling snow. I sat there, alone, the words still staring back at me from the window. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going home. Driving long stretches at night can mess with your head. I'd been on the road for hours, delivering a few Christmas packages to make some extra cash before the holidays. The highways were empty, the kind of quiet that makes the world feel smaller. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the truck. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. The weather report said snow was coming, but so far it was just bitter cold. The frost was creeping up the corners of the windshield despite the heater blasting on high. I tightened my grip on the wheel, adjusting my position to stay awake. There was nothing out there. No cars, no lights, just the endless stretch of road disappearing into the dark. Then my phone rang. It startled me, sharp and sudden in the silence. The screen lit up on the passenger seat, displaying an unknown number. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Hello?" I said, keeping one hand on the wheel. A moment of static crackled. Then a man's voice came through, deep, flat, and calm. "Have you passed the car with the red trunk yet?" I frowned, glancing at the road ahead. There was nothing in sight. "What? Who is this?" The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a second, then tossed it back on the seat. Probably a prank. People get bored, especially around the holidays. I shook it off and kept driving, though my nerves felt a little sharper now. The road seemed darker, quieter, like the air itself was holding its breath. 10 minutes later, I saw it. A car pulled over on the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, casting faint orange glows against the snow-dusted asphalt. As I got closer, I saw the trunk was wide open and red. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowed the truck, easing into the opposite lane to give it space. The car looked old, a boxy sedan with peeling paint. I didn't see anyone inside, no movement, just the blinking lights and the open trunk, gaping like a black hole. I passed it, my heart thudding against my ribs. My eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see someone step out or wave me down. But the car stayed still, shrinking into the distance until it disappeared entirely. My phone rang again. I hesitated, staring at it as it buzzed on the seat. The same number. I didn't want to answer, but something made me pick it up. "Hello?" The same voice, steady and emotionless. "Why didn't you stop?" My throat tightened. "Who is this? What do you want?" "You should have stopped," the voice said. "It's too late now." The line went dead again. I slammed the phone down, my pulse racing. My hands were sweating despite the cold. I didn't understand what was happening, but I didn't want to think about it. I pressed harder on the gas, focusing on the road ahead. A few minutes later, my headlights caught something in the distance. Another car parked on the shoulder. The same car, same red trunk, same blinking hazards. I froze. My foot eased off the gas as I stared at it. It couldn't be the same car. I'd left it miles back. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else had the same beat-up sedan. But as I passed, I saw it. The trunk was still open, and the license plate was the same. The same scratches, the same dents. It was the same car. My chest tightened. I pressed the gas, my truck groaning as it picked up speed. My eyes darted to the mirrors, watching the car shrink behind me. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Then the phone rang again. I grabbed it without thinking, nearly dropping it as I hit the answer button. "What the hell do you want?" "Stop," the voice said. "You have to stop." I screamed into the phone, slamming my fist against the steering wheel. "Leave me alone." The line went dead. I threw the phone onto the seat, my hands shaking. The highway stretched on, empty and endless. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the frost on the windshield seemed thicker now, like it was trying to block my view. A shape appeared in the distance. My stomach twisted. It was the car again, the red trunk glowing faintly in the cold light of my beams. The hazards blinked, slower this time, like they were struggling to stay on. I didn't slow down. I gritted my teeth, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers ached. As I passed the car, I stared straight ahead, refusing to look at it. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. I just wanted to get away. A loud thump made me jump. Something had hit the side of the truck. I swerved, the tires skidding on the icy road. I fought to keep control, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally straightened out, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood in the middle of the road, barely visible in the red glow of my taillights. They didn't move, just stood there, watching as I sped away. The phone rang again. I ignored it. The buzzing filled the cab, relentless and sharp. I reached over and grabbed it, ready to throw it out the window, but the screen was blank. No number, no call, just a black screen. The buzzing stopped. I threw the phone onto the floor, my hands trembling. The truck roared down the highway, the speedometer climbing higher than I usually let it. I didn't care about the ice or the curves. I just needed to keep moving. The road ahead stretched into the dark, empty and silent. But in the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I glanced at the passenger window and froze. The reflection in the glass wasn't mine. A face stared back at me, pale, with hollow eyes and a wide, empty grin. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the highway. I looked around, frantic. The passenger seat was empty. The road was empty. The face was gone. I sat there, the truck idling, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against the floor. I didn't pick it up. I didn't move. After a few minutes, I forced myself to drive. The truck crept forward, my hands shaking as I guided it back onto the road. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to keep going. The phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't look at it. I kept driving, the highway stretching endlessly into the dark. And in the rearview mirror, I saw it, the red trunk blinking faintly behind me. Live alone in a one-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, just a small place near the edge of town. It's quiet most of the time. The kind of quiet where you can hear the fridge hum and the faint buzz of the streetlights outside. I liked it that way, or at least I used to. The first night it happened, I thought I was imagining things. I'd just gotten home from a long shift, tossed my bag on the floor, and went straight to the kitchen to grab a beer. The apartment was dark, except for the faint orange glow of the streetlight through the blinds. I cracked the beer open and headed to the couch, kicking my shoes off along the way. My foot bumped into something, a shoe, but it wasn't mine. I frowned and looked down. It was a black boot, caked with dried mud. Definitely not mine. I didn't even own boots like that. My stomach did this weird flip. I stood there for a second, staring at the boot like it was going to explain itself. Then I checked the door, locked, just like I'd left it. The windows were closed too. I told myself it had to be left over from when my brother visited last week. He probably forgot it. I put the boot by the door and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't shake this feeling, like something was off. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. It wasn't a sound that woke me. At least, I didn't think so. It was more like a shift, like the air in the room was different. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding a little too fast. The apartment was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I stayed still, listening. Nothing. Just the fridge humming in the kitchen. I told myself I was being paranoid and laid back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, things got weirder. My keys weren't where I'd left them. They were on the kitchen counter instead of the hook by the door. I knew I didn't leave them there. I always hang them up. Little things like that kept happening. A chair slightly pulled out from the table. A cabinet door left open. I started to think I was losing it. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the air that felt different. It was a sound, faint, barely audible, like a soft shuffle. It came from the living room. My chest tightened. I didn't move at first, just laid there, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again. This time, it was closer. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my hand was shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the door. Nothing. The apartment was dead silent now. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe the neighbors. I got up, gripping the phone like it was a weapon, and crept toward the living room. My bare feet were silent on the carpet. The glow from the streetlight barely lit the room. Everything looked normal. Then I saw it. The boot. It wasn't by the door anymore. It was in the middle of the living room, sitting there like someone had put it on display. My heart was racing. I backed up into the hallway, my eyes darting to every shadow. The apartment felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I grabbed my jacket and left, spent the rest of the night in my car, parked a few blocks away. The next day I called the landlord, told him someone must have a key to my place. He changed the locks that afternoon, but I could tell he thought I was crazy. Maybe I was, but I felt better knowing the locks were new. That night, I slept with the lights on. Everything was quiet. I started to think it was over. Just some weird coincidence or my imagination running wild. I almost convinced myself, until the 3rd night. I came home late, around midnight. The apartment felt normal, like nothing had happened. I checked the door, locked, checked the windows, locked. The boot was gone. I'd thrown it in the dumpster the day before. I ate a quick dinner and went to bed, leaving the lamp on this time. I fell asleep pretty quickly, the exhaustion finally catching up with me. But then I woke up again, same time as before, 3 a.m. This time I heard breathing. It was soft, steady, just outside my bedroom door. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I sat up slowly, the mattress creaking under me. The breathing stopped. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a club. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. The hallway was empty. I checked the living room, empty. The kitchen, empty. But when I turned back toward the bedroom, I saw it. The boot, sitting right in the doorway. I froze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I'd thrown it out. I knew I had. My hands were shaking as I bent down to pick it up. It felt cold, like it had been outside. I grabbed my keys and left. Didn't even bother putting on shoes. I drove straight to my brother's place and crashed on his couch. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed a place to stay for a while. The next day, I went back to the apartment. My brother came with me. We searched the place from top to bottom. Every closet, every cabinet, even under the bed. Nothing. No signs of anyone. But the boot was gone. I haven't been back since. My lease is up in a month and I'm not renewing it. Whatever was in that apartment, it wasn't just in my head. I don't care what anyone says. Something or someone was there. And I'm not sticking around to find out who. I remember exactly how that night started. December 24th, Christmas Eve. I was working late, driving my rideshare car to make some extra cash before the holidays. The streets were mostly empty, just a few people out trying to get home after last-minute shopping or holiday parties. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. Quiet nights mean easy money. I was parked near a gas station, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, when the app pinged. A new ride. The pickup location was close, just a couple of blocks away, on a street lined with small shops and apartments. The name on the request was Marie. No profile picture, but that wasn't unusual. I hit accept and started driving. The area was dimly lit, most of the stores closed for the holiday. My headlights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the wet pavement. The pickup spot was a narrow side street, the kind of place that always made me a little uneasy. I pulled up and stopped under a flickering streetlight. No one was there. I checked the app again. The location was right. I waited, tapping the wheel with my fingers, staring at the shadows along the sidewalk. Still nothing. I rolled down the passenger window and called out, "Marie?" No answer. Just the sound of the wind rustling through some loose Christmas decorations hanging from a lamppost. I was about to cancel the ride when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, stepping out from the darkness between two buildings. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, wearing a long coat and a scarf. Her face was pale, almost too pale, but her dark hair was neatly tucked under a knitted hat. She didn't smile or wave, just walked straight to the car and opened the back door. "You Marie?" I asked. She nodded, slipping into the seat and pulling the door shut behind her. Her movements were slow, deliberate. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost too soft to hear. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was sitting perfectly still, staring out the window. "No problem," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Where to?" She rattled off an address on the edge of town, a residential neighborhood, far enough away to make the ride worth it. I hit start on the app and pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, neither of us said anything. I focused on the road, my hands steady on the wheel. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional clatter of ice from the wipers scraping the windshield. She sat in the back, silent and still, her face turned toward the window. About 10 minutes into the drive, I glanced in the mirror again. She was still staring out the window, but her expression had changed. Her lips were moving, like she was whispering to herself. "You okay back there?" I asked. She didn't respond. I frowned, keeping one eye on the road and the other on the mirror. Her lips were still moving, faster now, like she was talking to someone I couldn't see. My stomach tightened. Something about it wasn't right. "Marie?" I tried again, louder this time. She stopped whispering. Her head turned slowly, and for the first time, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were dark, too dark, like the light didn't catch them at all. "You missed the turn," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I blinked, confused. "What? No, I didn't. The GPS says—" "The turn," she interrupted, her voice sharper now. "You missed it." I glanced at the GPS. The route was clear, straight ahead for another mile. "The app says we're on track," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned back to the window and started whispering again, her words too soft and fast for me to catch. My hands tightened on the wheel. The car suddenly felt too small, the air inside too thick. I drove in silence, my heart pounding harder with every mile. The road ahead was dark, no streetlights, no cars, just the faint glow of the headlights cutting through the cold night. Then the GPS beeped, announcing a turn up ahead. The road it led to wasn't a road. It was a dirt path, barely wide enough for the car, lined with trees that reached out like claws over the edge of the trail. I slowed to a stop, staring at the GPS in disbelief. "This can't be right," I muttered. "It is," she said from the back. Her voice was calm now, almost amused. "Take the turn." Every instinct screamed at me not to. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Just drive," she said. I didn't want to argue. I eased the car onto the path, the tires crunching over gravel and frozen dirt. The trees closed in around us, the headlights casting eerie shadows that danced across the branches. The GPS went silent, the screen frozen on the map. She started whispering again. I couldn't take it anymore. "What are you saying back there?" I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. Her whispering stopped. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest. Slowly she leaned forward, her face just visible in the edge of the mirror. "You'll see," she said, her lips curling into a small, unsettling smile. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the tires sliding on the icy ground. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, turning in my seat to face her. The back seat was empty. The door was still locked, the seatbelt still buckled. But she was gone. My breath caught in my throat, my hands trembling on the wheel. I spun back around, staring out the windshield. She was standing in the middle of the road. Her face was pale, her dark eyes locked on mine. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, illuminated by the headlights. I hit reverse, the car lurching backward down the narrow path. The tires skidded on the ice, the branches scraping against the windows. When I finally reached the main road, I slammed the car into drive and sped off, not daring to look back. The app pinged again, another ride request. I ignored it. The GPS recalculated, the screen flashing with a new route. I ignored that too. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. When I finally parked, I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty back seat. The faint smell of her perfume still lingered in the air. I haven't driven at night since, and I never take pickups from names I don't recognize. I didn't trust the GPS the second it gave me that route. I'd been a delivery driver for years, covering the same areas. I knew most of the roads by heart. This wasn't one of them, but I was running late on Christmas Eve, and the app insisted this was the fastest way. A client had paid extra for express delivery, so I went along with it. The first 10 minutes were fine. Normal streets, quiet houses, and the occasional porch glowing with Christmas lights. Then the GPS voice told me to turn left. The street was narrow and dark, lined with bare trees that swayed in the wind. No cars, no lights, just endless shadows. I hesitated but made the turn. "Continue for 2 miles, the GPS said. Its robotic tone felt off, like it was slower than usual, too deliberate. The road narrowed even more, barely wide enough for my van. The pavement turned to gravel, and my tires crunched loudly in the silence. My headlights caught frost-covered branches hanging low over the path. I kept checking the app, but the map didn't show any other roads nearby. Just this one, cutting straight through a patch of forest. I didn't like it, but I figured it'd connect to the main road eventually. It had to. The wind picked up, shaking the trees. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. The radio signal faded, leaving only static. I turned it off. The GPS spoke again. "In 800 feet, turn right." I slowed down, squinting ahead. There was no road to the right, just trees. I glanced at the app, and it showed a sharp right turn ahead. But there was nothing out there. The headlights didn't catch any signs, no openings in the forest. The voice repeated itself. "Turn right." I stopped the van, my fingers drumming on the wheel. The GPS had to be wrong. There was no way through. I zoomed in on the map, but the app glitched, the screen flashing between my location and a blank grid. I reached for my phone, trying to restart it, when the voice came again. "Turn right, now." It wasn't robotic anymore. The tone had shifted, sharper and more human. I froze, my heart pounding. The app's screen was frozen, the loading icon spinning endlessly. My eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. It was empty. Just the faint outline of the van's interior and the dark road behind me. I took a deep breath and turned the van around. I wasn't going to follow the GPS anymore. I'd backtrack and find another way, even if it cost me time. The gravel crunched under the tires as I reversed, the headlights illuminating the same twisted branches. "Make a U-turn," the GPS said, its voice mechanical again. "Make a U-turn, make a U-turn." I ignored it, my jaw tightening as the voice repeated itself. Over and over, the same command. I switched the GPS off completely. The screen went dark, but the voice didn't stop. "Make a U-turn." My hands were slick with sweat as I tightened my grip on the wheel. I focused on the road, refusing to look at the device. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in like a tunnel. The wind howled louder, rattling the van. The headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure. It stood just off the gravel, motionless, barely visible in the beam of light. My stomach twisted. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was wearing a long coat, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move as I passed, didn't even flinch. I drove faster, my pulse racing. The gravel rattled against the undercarriage as I sped up, the van bouncing over uneven patches of road. The voice was louder now, echoing in my ears. "Make a U-turn." I clenched my teeth, refusing to look at the GPS. Then the voice changed again. "You're going the wrong way," it said. The words were calm, almost mocking. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing in the middle of the road now, directly in the path of my taillights. It wasn't possible. I'd left him far behind. But there he was, perfectly still, watching me. I floored it. The van roared forward, the gravel giving way to patches of icy pavement. The trees blurred past, their twisted branches catching in the corners of my vision. I didn't care where the road led anymore. I just needed to get out. The voice came again, softer this time. "Why are you running?" I slammed my hand against the GPS, trying to shut it up, but the screen was already off. The voice didn't stop. "You can't leave," it said. "Turn around." The road ahead twisted sharply, and I barely made the turn. The van skidded, the tires losing grip on the icy ground. My chest tightened as I fought to keep control. The trees on either side seemed closer now, their branches scraping against the van like claws. Then the road ended. I hit the brakes, the van sliding to a stop inches from a ditch. The headlights illuminated an empty field, the ground covered in frost. There was no road ahead, no path to follow, just a wall of trees on the other side. I threw the van into reverse, my hands shaking. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and I backed up slowly, trying to turn around. The wind outside was deafening now, slamming against the van with enough force to make it rock. In the rearview mirror, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. The voice came again, louder than ever. "Turn around." I hit the gas, the van jerking forward. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, pressing down on me like a weight. The voice kept talking, the words blending into a low, guttural hum. I didn't stop driving until I saw the glow of streetlights in the distance. The gravel turned back to pavement, the forest giving way to open fields. The voice stopped. The van was silent, except for the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. I pulled into a gas station, my hands trembling as I parked. The GPS was still off, the screen blank. I didn't turn it back on. I didn't even touch it. I just sat there, staring at the lights of the station, grateful for their warmth. I never finished the delivery. The package is still in the back of the van, unopened. I don't care. Whatever that was, whatever happened on that road, I'm not going back. And I'm never trusting the GPS again. I was tired, dead tired. It was Christmas Eve, and I'd been driving all day to get to my next job in another state. By the time I saw the flickering neon sign of the roadside hotel, it felt like a godsend. The snow had picked up, turning the highway into a slippery mess, and I couldn't risk another hour on the road. I pulled into the small lot, parked, and grabbed my overnight bag. The place was as basic as it gets. A one-story building with a line of rooms, each door numbered in faded paint. The office was a cramped little space with a bell on the counter. I rang it, and a man shuffled out from the back. He looked as tired as I felt, wearing a stained sweater and a forced smile. "Room for one?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, pulling out my card. "Just one night." He handed me a key with a big plastic tag that said Room 6. "Breakfast's at 7, checkout's at 10. "Got it, thanks." The room was exactly what I expected. Cheap carpet, outdated furniture, a bed that looked clean enough if you didn't look too closely. I locked the door behind me, threw my bag on the chair, and sat on the edge of the bed. The heater groaned to life, filling the room with dry, warm air. Outside, the snow kept falling, tapping lightly against the window. I kicked off my shoes, turned on the small TV, and flipped through the channels. Static on most of them, but I found an old Christmas movie and left it on for background noise. I wasn't really watching it. My eyes kept drooping, my head nodding forward. I decided to call it a night. The bed was stiff, but after the day I'd had, it didn't matter. I pulled the blankets up, turned off the light, and let the sound of the TV lull me to sleep. I woke up to knocking. It was soft at first, just a faint tap, tap, tap. I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Louder this time. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding in the sudden quiet. The TV was off. I didn't remember turning it off. I lay there for a moment, listening. The knocking came again, steady and deliberate. It was coming from my door. I sat up, the bed creaking beneath me. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice rough from sleep. No answer, just the sound of the wind outside. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. It was 3:12 a.m. I slid out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. The knocking started again, harder now. My chest tightened. I moved to the door, keeping my steps light, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I stood there, my breath fogging up the peephole. The hallway was empty, just the faint yellow light from the overhead fixtures and the shadows cast by the snow blowing against the windows. I waited, my heart thudding in my ears. Another knock. This time it came from the window. I spun around, my stomach lurching. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something pressed against the glass. A hand, pale with fingers splayed out against the frost. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. No response. The hand slid down the glass, leaving a smear of frost behind. Then it was gone. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, the screen showing a single bar that flickered uselessly. I stared at the curtains, waiting for something to happen, but everything was silent again. I finally worked up the courage to pull them back. The window was empty, just a layer of frost and snow clinging to the glass. The lot outside was covered in fresh snow, untouched except for my car. No footprints, no sign of anyone. I locked the door, checked it twice, and shoved the chair under the handle for good measure. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into bed. I left the lamp on this time, the warm light cutting through the shadows. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to swing open. But the night passed without any more knocks. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. I packed up quickly, eager to get back on the road. As I stepped outside, I noticed something. My car wasn't the only one in the lot anymore. There was another car, parked 2 spaces away, a beat-up sedan with fogged-up windows. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. I walked over to the office to drop off the key. The man from the night before was there, sipping coffee and looking half asleep. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing up at me. I hesitated. "Yeah, just... Was someone knocking on doors last night?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Like, around 3 in the morning. Someone knocked on my door. And the window." His face went pale. "Room 6? I nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me like he didn't know what to do. Finally, he shook his head. "There shouldn't have been anyone out there. We don't even have another guest." I pointed toward the lot. "What about the sedan?" He frowned, standing up and looking out the window. "What sedan?" We both looked. The lot was empty. My car was the only one there. I didn't say anything else, just handed him the key and left. As I pulled back onto the highway, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale hand again. But there was nothing. I haven't stayed in a roadside hotel since, and I never will. I never take the midnight train, but that night I didn't have a choice. My car had broken down, and I'd missed the earlier schedule. It was December, cold enough to make your breath feel like shards of glass in your throat. The station was nearly empty, just a few tired-looking people sitting on the benches, bundled in coats and scarves. The train pulled in right on time, its headlights cutting through the thick fog. The screech of its brakes echoed across the platform. The car I boarded was almost empty. There were a couple of passengers scattered around, a man hunched over in his seat, a woman flipping through a magazine, and a kid with headphones staring out the window. No one looked up as I walked past them to find a seat near the back. The train started moving, the vibration humming through the floor. The windows were fogged up, and the world outside was a blur of black and white. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was almost soothing. Almost. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something strange. The air felt colder, like the heater had stopped working. I rubbed my hands together and blew on them, trying to warm up. The car was eerily quiet. No one was talking, no phones ringing, no chatter, just the sound of the train moving. I looked around. The woman with the magazine was gone. So was the kid with the headphones. The man who'd been sitting near the middle was still there, but he hadn't moved. He was hunched over, his head down, his coat draped loosely over his shoulders. I thought maybe I'd dozed off and missed them leaving at a stop, but when I glanced out the window, the landscape hadn't changed. Just endless stretches of snow-covered fields and leafless trees, no station, No lights. The man finally moved. He shifted slightly, his coat slipping off his shoulder. That's when I noticed his hands. They were pale, too pale, almost gray. His fingers were long and thin, resting unnaturally still on his knees. I turned my attention to the door at the end of the car. I figured I'd move up a few cars, find someone else. Sitting there alone didn't feel right. I grabbed my bag and stood up. As I walked past the man, his head snapped up. His face was wrong. The skin was tight and pale, stretched over sharp cheekbones. His eyes were sunken, too dark, like there was nothing behind them. His mouth twitched, almost like he was trying to smile but couldn't quite figure out how. "Where are you going?" he asked. His voice was flat, cold, like the words didn't belong to him. "Just moving up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just stared at me, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying something he didn't understand. I hurried past him and pushed through the door to the next car. This one was completely empty. No passengers, no conductor, just rows of seats and the faint hum of the train. The lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. I kept walking, moving through car after car. Each one was the same, empty, silent, the lights flickering. The farther I went, the colder it got. My breath fogged up in front of me, and my fingers started to go numb. When I reached the end of the fifth car, the door wouldn't open. I pulled at it, my hands slipping on the cold metal handle. It was locked. I turned around, planning to head back to the other cars. The man was standing at the far end of the car, just inside the door I'd come through. My heart jumped into my throat. He hadn't followed me. I hadn't heard the door open or the sound of footsteps. But there he was, standing perfectly still, staring at me. "You shouldn't have left," he said. I backed away, my hands searching blindly for the handle of the locked door behind me. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just started walking toward me, slow and deliberate. His footsteps echoed, too loud in the empty car. I yanked at the door handle, my breath coming in short gasps. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, he was closer. "Stay back!" I shouted, panic tightening my throat. He stopped, his head tilted again, that same strange bird-like motion. "You can't leave." The lights went out completely. The train plunged into darkness, the hum of the wheels on the tracks the only sound. I pressed myself against the door, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. When the lights flickered back on, he was gone. I didn't wait. I ran, sprinting back through the empty cars, my bag thudding against my side. Each car felt colder than the last, the air so icy it burned my lungs. The windows were completely fogged now, the world outside hidden behind a curtain of frost. I reached the car I'd started in and collapsed into a seat, my heart racing. The man wasn't there. The car was empty, just like the others. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overtired, my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to catch my breath, the cold air stabbing at my throat. Then I saw it. In the window across from me, someone had written 2 words in the fogged glass. "Get off." My stomach dropped. The train didn't seem to be slowing down. There were no announcements, no signs of an upcoming station. I stood up, my legs shaky, and made my way to the nearest door. The emergency exit lever was there, red and bright against the gray metal. I hesitated. The train was still moving fast, the ground outside a blur of white and black. Jumping off wasn't an option, but staying didn't feel safe either. The lights flickered again, and I heard footsteps, slow, steady, coming from the far end of the car. I didn't turn around. I grabbed the emergency lever and yanked it down. The door hissed open, freezing air rushing in. Snow whipped against my face, sharp as needles. I clung to the frame, staring at the ground rushing by. The footsteps were closer now, just a few seats behind me. I didn't think. I jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I hit the snow hard, tumbling down an embankment, my bag flying out of my hand. When I finally stopped, I was lying on my back, staring up at the night sky. My body ached and my lungs burned, but I was alive. The train was gone. Just a faint hum in the distance, fading into the night. I lay there for a while, too stunned to move. When I finally sat up, I saw the tracks stretching out in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. There were no lights, no stations, no signs of civilization. Just the empty, snow-covered fields. I started walking, clutching my sides against the cold. It took hours before I finally reached a road. A passing truck driver picked me up, his face full of concern when he saw me. "What happened to you?" he asked. I didn't know how to explain. I just shook my head and muttered, "Wrong train." I still don't know what I saw that night, or where that train was going. But I haven't set foot on one since, and I never will. I was on the 10:15 train, heading back to my parents' house for Christmas. The plan was simple: arrive by midnight, catch up with family, and get a full night's sleep before the holiday chaos started. The train was almost empty, just a few passengers scattered throughout the car. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you don't usually get in the city. I'd been up since 6 a.m. and was dead tired. Somewhere after the halfway point, I dozed off. The gentle rocking of the train and the hum of the wheels made it impossible to stay awake. When I opened my eyes again, the train wasn't moving. We'd stopped. I blinked, trying to shake the grogginess. The car was dimly lit, and the windows were fogged up. I couldn't see outside. There was no announcement, no sign of a station. I glanced around. Most of the passengers were gone, except for a man sitting at the far end, slumped in his seat like he'd fallen asleep too. "Hey," I called out, my voice raspy from sleep. He didn't move. I grabbed my bag and stood up, heading toward the door to see what was going on. As I got closer, the conductor appeared, stepping into the car from the connecting door. "End of the line," he said, his voice clipped. "What?" I asked. "This isn't my stop. I'm going to Westbrook." "This is where you get off," he said, not even looking at me. His uniform was neat, but something about him felt off. His cap sat too low on his forehead, hiding his eyes. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. I hesitated. "Are you sure? This doesn't look like—" "This is your stop," he interrupted. Before I could argue, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the next car. I stood there for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. Something didn't feel right, but I didn't have much choice. I stepped off the train, my bag slung over my shoulder. The platform was freezing, the air thick with fog. The train hissed and groaned as it started moving again. I turned to watch it pull away, its lights vanishing into the mist. And then I was alone. The station was small, just a concrete platform with a single bench and a rusted-over sign that didn't have a name. The fog was so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I pulled out my phone, but it had no signal. The battery was at 15%. "Great," I muttered, shoving it back into my pocket. I looked around for a station building, some kind of shelter or office, but there was nothing. Just the platform, the fog, and the faint sound of wind. I tried calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed into the mist, but no one answered. I walked along the platform, hoping to find an exit or a sign that made sense. After a few minutes, I came across something that made my stomach drop. A suitcase. It was old, with leather straps and scuffs on the corners, sitting in the middle of the platform like someone had left it there in a hurry. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I approached the suitcase cautiously, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. There was a name tag attached to the handle, but the writing was smudged, illegible. I crouched down and opened it. Inside were clothes, a toothbrush, and a wallet. The ID inside had a picture of a man with graying hair, but the name was blurred, like the ink had run. I stood up, my pulse racing. Something about this felt wrong. I left the suitcase where it was and started walking again, faster this time. The platform seemed longer than it should have been, stretching into the fog without end. I kept walking, my breaths coming out in quick puffs of steam. After what felt like forever, I saw another figure up ahead, someone standing near the edge of the platform. "Hey!" I called, relief flooding through me. "Hey, wait!" The figure didn't move. I broke into a jog, my bag bouncing against my side. As I got closer, I slowed down. The figure wasn't moving because it wasn't a person. It was a mannequin. Its plastic face was smooth and blank, with no features except for faint indentations where eyes and a mouth should have been. It was dressed in a coat and scarf, standing perfectly still like it had been placed there. My chest tightened. I backed away, my hands shaking. The fog seemed thicker now, the air colder. I turned around, ready to head back to where I started. But when I looked, the suitcase was there again, sitting in the middle of the platform. I hadn't gone in a circle. I was sure of it. My heart was pounding now, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I grabbed my phone and tried to call someone, anyone. The screen flickered, then went black. Dead. I threw the phone back in my pocket and started running. I didn't care where the platform led anymore. I just needed to move. My footsteps echoed louder and louder, blending with the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, footsteps behind me. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound stopped too. I turned around slowly. The mannequin was closer now, standing in the middle of the platform where I'd just been. Its head was tilted slightly, like it was watching me. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. The fog was thicker than ever, swallowing everything around me. I couldn't see the end of the platform, couldn't see anything but the gray mist and the faint outline of the tracks below. The footsteps came again, faster this time, closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder. There were more of them now, figures moving in the fog, their shapes barely visible. Some were tall, others hunched over, all of them closing in. My foot caught on something, and I hit the ground hard. Pain shot through my knee, but I scrambled to my feet, ignoring it. The figures were closer, their outlines sharper now. They weren't mannequins. They were people, or at least they used to be. Their faces were pale and featureless, their clothes faded and torn. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. They didn't stop. I turned and ran again, my heart hammering in my chest. The platform seemed endless, stretching out forever. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it, a faint light cutting through the fog. The train. It was coming back. I sprinted toward the edge of the platform, waving my arms. The train slowed, its headlights blinding in the thick mist. I reached the door just as it hissed open and jumped inside, collapsing onto the floor. The train started moving again, the doors sliding shut. I sat there, gasping for air, my body trembling. When I finally looked up, the car was empty. No passengers, no conductor. I stayed there, sitting on the floor, until the train stopped again. This time, it was my stop. The station was bright and bustling, filled with people heading home for the holidays. I stepped off the train, the cold air biting at my face. When I turned back, the train was gone. I don't know where that station was, or what happened to the others who were left behind, but I know one thing. I'll never fall asleep on a train again.